Strategic pause pressure. Imagine sitting across from someone in a tense conversation. The question has been asked, the air is still, and you wait. Just wait. Seconds stretch longer than they should. The silence feels heavy, unbearable. And then, it happens. The other person speaks, not because they planned to, not because they wanted to, but because the silence itself became too much to endure. This is the strategic pause, a psychological tactic as subtle as it is powerful. It turns silence into a weapon, a pressure that pries open the mind and draws out truths people never meant to share. Most of us are terrified of silence in conversation. We rush to fill it, to reassure ourselves that connection is intact, that the dialogue is safe. A pause of even a few seconds can feel like an eternity, a social void that must be patched with words. But in skilled hands, that void becomes a trap. By simply refusing to fill the silence, by letting the pause linger, you shift the weight of discomfort onto the other person. And more often than not, they crack. This technique is famously used in interrogation rooms. Detectives will ask a suspect a question, then fall completely still. They don't argue, don't clarify, don't rush. They wait. The silence becomes unbearable, and the suspect, desperate to end it, begins to talk. They offer justifications, excuses, details, sometimes even confessions. The pause squeezes them harder than direct questioning ever could. Words spill out, not because they were demanded, but because the human brain abhors silence in social exchange. It works outside interrogation, too. Negotiators use it at the bargaining table. Ask for a price, then go silent. The other side feels compelled to speak, to justify, to adjust their offer. In job interviews, a well-placed pause after an applicant's answer often prompts them to reveal more about themselves, sometimes things they didn't intend to share. Even in everyday arguments, the person who can tolerate silence longest usually controls the conversation. The psychology behind it is simple but devastating. Humans are social creatures. We are wired to maintain rhythm in dialogue, a give and take of speech that signals cooperation. When that rhythm breaks, when silence intrudes, the brain interprets it as threat, rejection, or tension. Anxiety spikes. The mind scrambles for escape, and escape comes in the form of words. Strategic silence weaponizes this instinct, making the other person's discomfort work against them. But there's another layer. A pause doesn't just pressure, it amplifies. Whatever words follow the silence carry more weight, more intensity. The listener leans in, eager to break the void, and so every word lands harder. Silence becomes the dark frame around the bright painting, sharpening whatever emerges inside it. Used well, the pause doesn't just extract truth, it magnifies it. Yet, this tactic is not without risk. Misused, it can backfire. Prolonged silence can breed hostility, mistrust, even resentment. In personal relationships, it can feel like manipulation, a cold refusal to engage. But in calculated moments, in negotiations, interrogations, debates, and high-stakes conversations, the strategic pause can shift power entirely. It is not what you say, it is what you don't say that decides the outcome. Think about this. In a world obsessed with talking, those who master silence gain an almost unfair advantage. The strategic pause turns emptiness into influence, quiet into control. It proves that words are not the only currency of communication. Sometimes the absence of them is worth more than anything you could say. So the next time you feel pressure to rush, to fill every gap with chatter, stop. Hold the silence. Let the pause stretch a little longer than comfort allows. You may be surprised at what tumbles out of the other person's mouth, not because you forced it, but because silence itself demanded it. Withheld response tension. Picture yourself in a conversation. You've just said something. Maybe an opinion, maybe a confession, maybe just a casual remark. And then, silence. The person across from you does not answer. No nod, no smile, no disagreement, not even the smallest acknowledgement. just the empty space of their withheld response. At first, you tell yourself it's nothing. Maybe they're thinking. Maybe they didn't hear. But as the silence stretches, a strange tension grows inside you. Doubt begins to bloom. Did you say something wrong? Do they disagree? Do they think less of you now? The silence doesn't stay empty. It becomes heavy, charged, almost unbearable. This is the power of withheld response tension, a psychological phenomenon where the absence of reaction becomes more powerful than any words could be. Human communication is not just about words. It is about the rhythm of exchange, the back and forth of speaking and being acknowledged. Every time you say something, you unconsciously expect a signal in return, a nod, a laugh, a simple "I see." These responses act like social glue, telling you that your words landed, that you were heard, that you still belong. But when the response is withheld, when acknowledgement is denied, the mind recoils. The silence feels unnatural, even threatening. What should have been a moment of connection turns into a void that your brain rushes to fill with self-doubt. Psychologists have studied this effect in groups, classrooms, negotiations, and therapy sessions. The results are striking. When someone's statement is met with silence, they begin to soften their position, retract their words, or even contradict themselves. The discomfort becomes so sharp that people will change their minds simply to escape the unease. Silence, in this way, is not passive. It is active pressure. It pushes the speaker to question themselves, to seek relief by altering their message, by bending, by conceding. Think of how this plays out in daily life. In relationships, one partner may withhold a response to subtly punish the other. The infamous silent treatment works not because words are spoken, but because words are denied. The one left in silence begins to spin stories, each more painful than the last, about why they are being ignored. In workplaces, a boss may respond to an idea not with critique but with nothing at all. And in that nothing, the employee feels their confidence drain away, as though the silence itself was judgment. Even in casual conversations, a pause that is too long can flip light-hearted talk into awkward self-consciousness. This is because the human brain is wired to crave feedback. From infancy, we search for responses in the faces and voices around us. A baby smiles, and if the mother does not respond, distress follows almost instantly. That need for acknowledgement never leaves us. As adults, we may pretend to be independent, immune to others' reactions, but deep down, we are still wired to seek signs that we are seen and understood. Silence, therefore, becomes a violation of that wiring. It denies the feedback loop, and in that denial, it creates tension. And yet, silence is also a tool. Negotiators often use withheld responses deliberately, allowing the other side to fill the gap with concessions. Therapists sometimes remain quiet, creating space for clients to confront their own thoughts. Leaders can wield silence to unsettle or to command respect. The absence of words becomes its own kind of speech, powerful precisely because it forces the other person to wrestle with uncertainty. Silence does not mean nothing. It often means more than words ever could. But there is also danger here. When silence is weaponized, it erodes trust. Too much withheld response breeds anxiety, resentment, and fear. The one left hanging in silence may eventually withdraw, deciding it is safer not to speak at all. In this way, silence can destroy relationships as easily as it can shape them. What begins as tension becomes distance, and what begins as uncertainty becomes disconnection. The paradox of withheld response tension is that it reveals just how fragile communication really is. We imagine conversation as a simple act. One person speaks, the other replies. But beneath that simplicity lies a delicate psychological contract. Every word depends on the reassurance that it will be met with recognition. Break that contract, and the words collapse under their own weight. And yet, there is something profoundly human in this fragility. The discomfort of silence shows how deeply we long to be acknowledged, how much we depend on others to confirm our sense of reality. Without that confirmation, we falter. With it, we thrive. The power of a nod, a murmur, a glance, is greater than we realize. Words matter, but sometimes the absence of words matters more. So the next time you speak and are met with silence, notice what happens inside you. Notice how quickly doubt rises, how urgently you want to fill the void. That is withheld response tension at work, the invisible weight of silence pressing against your confidence. And remember this, silence is never empty. It is charged, it is sharp, and it can alter the course of conversations, relationships, even lives. Silence as disapproval. Imagine sharing an idea with a group. Your voice carries it into the room, your words hang in the air, and for a brief moment you expect response, a nod, a question, even a challenge. But instead, silence. No one speaks. No one reacts. The pause stretches longer than it should. In that void, meaning takes shape. The absence of words feels louder than any criticism. You sense rejection, not through what is said, but through what is withheld. This is silence as disapproval, one of the most subtle yet powerful forms of social communication, where people express judgment not with confrontation, but with the weight of nothing at all. Humans are wired to seek feedback in interaction. When we speak, we scan faces, tones, gestures for signs that we have been understood, accepted, or valued. Silence disrupts this feedback loop. It denies us the confirmation we crave, leaving our minds scrambling to interpret. And interpretation rarely lands in neutral ground. Silence feels cold. It feels like dismissal. It suggests that what you said was unworthy of response, or worse, unworthy of acknowledgement. In this way, silence becomes a kind of social weapon, subtle enough to be denied, powerful enough to wound. This dynamic plays out in countless arenas. In the workplace, a team member proposes a solution, and leaders respond with nothing. No, good point, no, let's think on it, not even a polite nod. The silence hangs, and the message is clear, your idea doesn't matter. Among friends, someone makes a joke that falls flat, and silence answers where laughter should have been. The quiet communicates rejection more sharply than words ever could. In relationships, silence can be punishment, a partner withholding speech to express disappointment without an argument. The absence of sound becomes a form of control, forcing the other to fill the void with guilt and doubt. Psychologists describe this as a form of nonverbal communication. Just as a frown signals displeasure and a smile signals warmth, silence signals withdrawal, rejection, or disapproval. But silence is even more ambiguous, and that ambiguity is what makes it so powerful. Unlike words, silence can always be denied. If confronted, the silent person can say, "I wasn't rejecting you, I was just thinking," or "I didn't know what to say." This plausible deniability protects the silent communicator, while still inflicting the sting of disapproval. It is both passive and aggressive, both deniable and undeniable at once. What makes silence so effective is its contrast with expectation. In human conversation, timing matters. A response is usually quick, a beat or two after words are spoken. When that beat is broken, when the pause lengthens into an empty space, the brain flags it as abnormal. Something is wrong. Silence carries weight precisely because it breaks the rhythm of interaction. It is not just an absence of sound, it is an interruption of the social contract that says, "I acknowledge you." Without that acknowledgement, the speaker feels erased. This effect has deep evolutionary roots. In our earliest communities, belonging meant survival. Being ignored or excluded was as dangerous as being attacked. The brain still interprets silence as a threat to social connection. Modern research even shows that social rejection, whether through silence or direct criticism, activates the same brain regions associated with physical pain. To be met with silence is not just emotionally uncomfortable, it is neurologically painful. And yet, silence as disapproval is not always cruel. Sometimes it is strategic. Parents use it with children, pausing, withholding response until the child senses they've crossed a line. Teachers use it in classrooms, letting the silence after a poor answer communicate dissatisfaction more effectively than scolding. Leaders use it to apply subtle pressure, making others reconsider their words without needing to confront them outright. Silence can discipline, correct, or guide, all without a single word spoken. But silence is also dangerous. When overused, it corrodes trust. A partner who punishes with silence, a boss who ignores rather than engages, a friend who withholds feedback. These behaviors do not simply communicate disapproval, they erode connection. Words may wound, but silence isolates. It leaves the rejected person alone with their doubts, replaying the silence again and again, amplifying its sting in memory long after the moment has passed. So the next time you find yourself on the receiving end of silence, pause and ask, what does it mean? Is it true rejection, or simply a moment of thought? And the next time you are tempted to use silence as disapproval, consider its weight. Sometimes quiet can guide more powerfully than criticism, but sometimes it can wound more deeply than words ever could. Silence, in the end, is never truly empty. It always speaks. The only question is what it says, and whether you are prepared to own the message it delivers. Time-stretched waiting. Imagine you ask someone an urgent question. The words leave your mouth quickly, expectantly, and you look at them for an answer. They hear you, of that you're certain. But instead of replying, they pause. They let the silence stretch. A second, then 2, then 5. The moment begins to feel heavier than it should. Your mind races. Did I say something foolish? Are they weighing my worth? Do they simply not care? And when their answer finally arrives, it feels slower, colder, more distant than it otherwise would have. That is the essence of time-stretched waiting, the strange power that comes from withholding a response. Our brains are wired to treat timing as a signal of value. Quick answers suggest eagerness, respect, and attention. They tell you, I heard you, and you matter enough for me to respond right away. But a delayed answer shifts the balance. The longer the silence, the more you begin to feel that your question, your request, your presence itself is less important. What changed is not the words, but the timing. The pause becomes a message. This is why silence is so often used as a tool of authority. In a business meeting, the manager who waits before answering a question seems more powerful than the one who blurts out a reply. In negotiations, silence is a weapon. One side makes an offer, the other sits in deliberate quiet, letting discomfort swell. The proposer feels compelled to fill the gap, often conceding more than they intended. Time-stretched waiting is not just absence of speech, it is control. Consider texting, one of the most common battlegrounds of modern communication. A message sent is a piece of yourself extended outward. A quick reply feels like validation, a signal of closeness. But when minutes stretch into hours or hours into days, the meaning of the delay eclipses the content of the reply. Doubt creeps in. Why aren't they answering? Am I unimportant? The delay itself becomes louder than any words. The one who controls the timing controls the emotional weight of the exchange. Psychologists see this as a form of temporal framing. Humans unconsciously equate speed with priority. If someone drops everything to answer you, you feel significant. If someone makes you wait, you feel smaller, subordinate. This is why high-status figures, executives, celebrities, leaders, often let others wait for them. The delay says, my time is scarce. Yours is plentiful. You must adapt to me. The power isn't in the words they eventually speak. It's in the fact that they controlled the silence leading up to them. But time-stretched waiting is not always manipulative. Sometimes silence means thoughtfulness. A teacher pauses before responding, giving weight to the question. A doctor hesitates before delivering a diagnosis, signaling care. A close friend holds the silence before answering something personal, showing they are taking it seriously. In these moments, the pause does not diminish value, it amplifies it. The same delay that weakens in one context can empower in another. And yet, when used deliberately as a tactic, the pause can be devastating. Toxic leaders often exploit it, responding slowly to requests so employees never feel secure. Partners in strained relationships use it to withhold reassurance, keeping the other guessing, hungry for recognition. Even in casual friendships, delayed responses can erode trust, leaving one person always wondering where they stand. Silence becomes a lever of control. The paradox of time-stretched waiting is that nothing is actually happening. No words are spoken, no gestures are made. And yet the absence itself reshapes perception, carving hierarchy into the interaction. The one who waits feels smaller, the one who withholds feels larger. All of this emerges not from action, but from deliberate inaction. So the next time you find yourself on the receiving end of a delayed response, notice what it does to you. Notice how seconds stretch into meaning, how silence writes a story in your mind. And the next time you are the one holding back an answer, ask yourself, are you creating space for thought, or are you silently asserting power? Because in the strange economy of human communication, time itself is currency. And the person who controls the timing of an answer often controls the entire conversation. Controlled brevity shock. Imagine sitting across from someone in a tense conversation. You've poured out sentences, explanations, justifications, your words spilling into the silence, desperate to fill the void. And then, after a long pause, they finally speak. But instead of matching your flood, they drop only a few razor-sharp words. The silence before stretched like a trap, and those short words cut deeper than any long speech could. This is the phenomenon of controlled brevity shock, the unsettling power of calculated silence followed by sudden, minimal response. Psychologically, silence itself already carries weight. When someone doesn't answer immediately, your brain scrambles to interpret. Are they angry? Are they judging? Are they calculating? The longer the silence stretches, the more your thoughts spiral. You begin filling the gaps yourself, layering anxiety, doubt, and tension into the moment. And then, just as the pressure feels unbearable, they speak, but only briefly. A fragment of language, small and deliberate, lands like a hammer blow. This works because of contrast. In ordinary conversation, people expect balance. If one person speaks at length, the other replies with similar rhythm. But controlled brevity breaks that rhythm. When someone speaks less after you've spoken more, it creates a hierarchy. Your words feel scattered, overexposed, vulnerable. Their words feel precise, dominant, almost surgical. They seize control of the interaction without raising their voice, without aggression. The imbalance itself becomes power. Think of an interrogation room. A suspect rambles nervously, offering half-truths and contradictions. The investigator sits in silence, listening, waiting. Then, finally, "Are you sure?" Just 2 words. The silence before gives those words the gravity of a confession. The suspect's own over-talking becomes a weapon turned against them. Or think of a courtroom. A lawyer lets a witness explain and elaborate, piling detail upon detail. Then, after a pause, the lawyer asks, "Why now?" The brevity carries an edge of suspicion that pages of cross-examination could never achieve. This effect appears in everyday life too. A partner in an argument says, "I've told you everything. I've explained myself again and again." The other remains silent. Finally, they whisper, "Enough." That single word carries the weight of finality, crushing the flood of words that came before. Or in business negotiations, one side lays out figures, strategies, desperate reasoning. The other side listens, then finally says, "Too high." Just 2 words, and the entire balance shifts. Controlled brevity shock works because humans are uncomfortable with asymmetry. We want conversation to feel reciprocal, equal. When someone withholds speech and then breaks the silence with brevity, it violates expectation. The listener feels exposed, off balance, even threatened. It is not the content of the words alone, it is the performance around them. The silence sets the stage. The brevity delivers the strike. But there's a darker truth here. Silence plus brevity doesn't just dominate others, it also rewires memory. People rarely remember the flood of words they spoke themselves, but they vividly remember the sharp fragments delivered after silence. The short line becomes the defining moment of the encounter. "We're done." "Not true." "Explain." Those words echo long after the conversation ends, haunting the mind with their precision. In a sense, controlled brevity shock is a form of psychological sleight of hand. By saying less, you make it feel like more. By withholding, you make your presence loom larger. It is a weapon used by interrogators, negotiators, manipulators, and even poets. Anyone who understands that silence is not emptiness but pressure, and that words delivered after silence explode with disproportionate force. So the next time you find yourself in a heated moment, notice the rhythm. Notice who fills the silence and who owns it. Because power often belongs not to the one who speaks the most, but to the one who waits the longest and then speaks the least. And when those few words finally land, they can feel less like conversation and more like a verdict, brief, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. Withdrawal mid-conflict. Imagine two people locked in an argument. Voices raised, emotions sharp, words flying like arrows. And then suddenly, one of them stops. No more words, no response, no acknowledgement. The silence is not calm, it is jagged, deliberate. The fight hasn't been resolved, yet one person has withdrawn completely, leaving the other suspended in unfinished tension. This is the tactic of withdrawal mid-conflict, and it is one of the most psychologically destabilizing moves in human interaction. Humans crave closure. It is not just a preference, it is a psychological need. When conflict erupts, the brain races toward resolution, whether through apology, compromise, or even escalation. To cut that process short is to deny the brain what it desperately seeks, an ending. The result is not relief, but agitation. The silence left behind doesn't cool emotions, it amplifies them. The other party is left circling unanswered questions, replaying words, chasing after meaning that will never arrive. This tactic often appears in toxic relationships. One partner walks out mid-argument or simply goes silent, refusing to engage. On the surface, it looks like control. I won't waste my energy fighting. But beneath it is manipulation. The person left behind spirals, their mind unable to settle, because the dialogue has no closure. Hours, days, even weeks can be consumed by the need to finish what was cut off. The withdrawal becomes more painful than the original disagreement. It is similar to the silent treatment, but sharper, more weaponized. The silent treatment avoids interaction altogether, often stretched over long periods. Withdrawal mid-conflict is targeted. It interrupts the rhythm of battle precisely at its peak. Imagine a symphony rising toward its climax, then cut off in mid-note. The unresolved chord lingers, unbearable, demanding completion. That is the emotional impact of walking away mid-fight. Psychologists link this to something called the Zeigarnik effect, the mind's tendency to remember and obsess over unfinished tasks more than completed ones. An argument abruptly abandoned becomes a wound the brain cannot let heal. The person left behind replays it again and again, searching for closure that never comes. The emotional strain deepens, not because of what was said, but because of what was withheld. This tactic is also used strategically in negotiations, debates, even interrogations. Walking away mid-discussion creates an imbalance of power. The one who withdraws appears to hold control, forcing the other party to chase, to reopen, to beg for the dialogue to resume. The silence is not absence, it is domination through absence. The person left behind is not free from the conflict. They are trapped inside it, alone. But here is the paradox. Withdrawal mid-conflict can feel powerful in the moment, but its long-term damage is immense. In relationships, it erodes trust, intimacy, and safety. The person on the receiving end begins to fear every argument, not because of the conflict itself, but because of the unbearable silence that might follow. Over time, communication breaks down, not from too much fighting, but from the refusal to finish the fight. And yet, the tactic persists because it works in the short term. The one who withdraws avoids discomfort. They sidestep vulnerability. They deny responsibility. And they leave the other person carrying the entire weight of the unresolved emotions. It is a clean escape, at least for one side. Think of the damage in human terms. A child watches their parents argue, only to see one storm out, slamming the door. The child feels the unfinished fight vibrating in the air hours later. A partner left mid-sentence feels abandoned, desperate to repair something that cannot be repaired alone. Even in friendships or workplaces, when someone shuts down mid-conflict, the silence spreads like poison, making trust brittle and conversation dangerous. Withdrawal mid-conflict reveals an uncomfortable truth. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is the sharpest blade. Sometimes it carves deeper wounds than words ever could. So the next time a conflict rises, and the urge comes to shut down, walk away, and cut off communication, remember what silence leaves behind. It is not resolution. It is not relief. It is an unfinished chord echoing in the other person's mind, a weight they will carry long after you've left the room. And sometimes, that silence shouts louder than anything you could have said. Blank expression barrier. Imagine saying something that matters to you, an idea, a confession, a joke you thought was clever. You look up, waiting for a reaction, and the person in front of you stares back with no smile, no frown, no raised eyebrow, no trace of recognition. Their face is blank, unreadable, like a wall. At first, you wait for a flicker of response. A second passes. Then another. Still nothing. And suddenly, the silence is no longer just quiet, it is oppressive. The absence of expression becomes a barrier, leaving you stranded on the other side, unsure if your words have landed or if they've fallen into an abyss. This is the blank expression barrier, a subtle but powerful psychological effect where the combination of silence and an unreadable face amplifies insecurity and forces the speaker to guess what the other person is thinking. Human beings are wired to seek feedback in every conversation. We depend on tiny cues, nods, smiles, narrowing eyes, shifting lips, to gauge whether we're being understood, whether we're accepted, whether we're safe. These micro-expressions are the thread that stitches our communication together, giving us the reassurance that our words have meaning. But when a face remains completely still, when silence pairs with emotional flatness, that thread is cut. The brain, left without signals, begins to panic. It starts searching for answers, spinning stories, often darker than the reality. Did I say something foolish? Did I offend them? Do they secretly disapprove? In the absence of expression, the mind fills the void with doubt. Psychologists have found that ambiguous reactions are often more unsettling than openly negative ones. A frown tells you where you stand. A sigh tells you what they feel. Even anger gives you information. But a blank face gives you nothing. It's a mask that reveals no truth, and in that vacuum of meaning, insecurity multiplies. The speaker begins to project their own fears into the silence, assuming the worst, questioning themselves, and sometimes even retracting or apologizing for things that never caused harm. Think of the classroom where a student shares an answer and the teacher responds with no expression at all. The student feels their confidence collapse, not because they were wrong, but because they cannot tell if they were right. Or think of a workplace meeting where someone offers an idea and the boss stares back blankly. The room fills with tension, and the speaker's voice falters, not because the idea is bad, but because the absence of feedback feels like judgment. The blank expression barrier is not neutral. It is powerful pressure disguised as nothing. Relationships are perhaps where this effect cuts deepest. A partner who responds to vulnerability with a flat stare creates emotional distance instantly. The person sharing begins to wonder if they've overstepped, if they're unworthy of care, if love itself has withered in the silence. The barrier is not just the lack of words, it is the wall of unreadability, which forces the vulnerable one to face their own insecurities alone. What makes the blank expression barrier so powerful is that it combines two forces, silence and ambiguity. Silence already creates discomfort, as the human mind craves acknowledgement. Add to that a face that refuses to reveal anything, and the effect multiplies. The mind becomes trapped, running in circles, guessing at hidden meanings. It is like standing before a locked door, hearing whispers inside, but never being allowed to enter. And yet, this tactic is sometimes used deliberately. Interrogators, negotiators, and even manipulative partners know the power of the blank stare. By refusing to reveal their reactions, they force the other person to over-explain, to stumble, to doubt themselves. The barrier does not need to attack, it simply needs to withhold. In that withholding, the speaker is left exposed, scrambling to bridge a gap that will never close. But there is also another side. Sometimes the blank expression barrier is not intentional. Some people simply process silently. Some struggle to show emotion on their face. And yet, even when unintended, the effect is real. The absence of cues still triggers the same uncertainty in those who crave reassurance. It is not about malice, it is about the brain's need for feedback, a need so deep that even neutrality feels like rejection. The paradox is this: the blank expression barrier is not nothing. It looks like absence, but it is presence, a powerful presence of ambiguity that destabilizes confidence. It reminds us that communication is never just about words. It is about the micro-expressions, the nods, the shifts, the signals that prove we are being understood. Remove those, and the words themselves begin to collapse. So the next time you speak and are met with a face that gives you nothing, notice what happens inside you. Notice how quickly your mind begins to fill in the blanks with insecurity. That is the blank expression barrier at work, the silent wall that forces you to doubt yourself. And remember this: silence paired with a mask is not neutral. It is sharp, it is heavy, and it can reshape the meaning of your words without a single sound being spoken. Omitted acknowledgement. Imagine telling someone something important, a story, a memory, a confession, and when you finish, there is no response. No nod, no I see, no I understand. Nothing. The words seem to vanish into the air. You search their face for recognition, but it stays blank. You repeat yourself, just to be sure, but still no confirmation comes. Slowly, doubt creeps in. Did I actually say it? Did they hear me? Am I remembering this right? This is the power of omitted acknowledgement, the subtle act of refusing to confirm that you've heard someone, a tactic that doesn't argue, doesn't contradict, but instead destabilizes. It leaves the speaker stranded in uncertainty, forcing them to second-guess their own memory and even their own reality. At first glance, it seems harmless. Silence, after all, is not an attack. But human communication is not built only on words, it is built on signals of recognition. Every conversation, no matter how ordinary, is threaded with tiny acknowledgments. Eye contact, nods, murmured ahas, and yes. These cues are not just politeness. They are anchors. They tell the speaker, you are heard, your words exist, your memory is shared. When those anchors are removed, the entire structure of conversation tilts. The listener's silence becomes an erasure, and the speaker begins to question themselves instead of the other. This tactic often surfaces in manipulative dynamics. A partner, a boss, or a friend may hear what you say but deliberately offer no acknowledgement. When you later reference it, remember, I told you about this, they can deny it, insisting you never did. Without the confirming anchor in the moment, you are left vulnerable. Memory is fragile. shaped not only by what you recall but by how others respond. Without acknowledgement, you begin to mistrust your own recollection. Over time, this creates a deeper fracture, the erosion of confidence in your own perception. Psychologists recognize this as a subtle tool of gaslighting. Unlike outright denial, which can be confronted and debated, omitted acknowledgement is slipperier. It offers nothing to challenge. You can't argue with silence. You can only feel its weight. And in that vacuum, the human brain tends to turn inward, searching for fault not in the other person but in itself. Did I phrase it clearly? Did I imagine saying it? Maybe I only thought it. The absence of recognition rewrites memory by planting doubt at its root. Consider how easily this can destabilize relationships. In a workplace, a manager who never acknowledges input leaves employees uncertain, hesitant, constantly questioning whether their contributions matter. In families, a parent who never affirms a child's words teaches them early to mistrust their own voice. In intimate relationships, a partner who omits acknowledgement can steadily dismantle their loved one's sense of reality, creating dependence and confusion. Over time, the target begins to repeat themselves compulsively, over-explain, or withdraw altogether, conditioned to expect that their words will disappear. And yet, the most unsettling part is that omitted acknowledgement is almost invisible. To outsiders, it looks like nothing happened. There was no argument, no harsh word, no visible wound. But the silence lingers in the mind of the speaker, echoing long after the moment ends. The next time they try to recall the memory, that echo distorts it. Was I heard or not? Did I speak or not? The manipulation is effective precisely because it cannot be pinned down. It lives in the absence, in what was not done. On the surface, this might sound like fragility on the speaker's part, but in reality, it reveals how deeply social beings depend on acknowledgement. Our sense of reality is not built alone. It is reinforced by others. Shared memories are stronger than solitary ones. Recognition makes an experience solid. Without it, even truth feels unstable. This is why torture and psychological manipulation so often involve silence and omission. To unravel a person, you do not always need lies. You only need to deny them confirmation. But the phenomenon is not always malicious. Sometimes omitted acknowledgement is unintentional, a distracted mind, a missed cue, a cultural difference in how much verbal affirmation is expected. Yet even in these cases, the effect can sting. The brain still craves closure, still reads silence as erasure. A casual failure to acknowledge can leave the other person unsettled, replaying the moment, wondering if their words even registered. So the next time someone speaks to you, notice how often you confirm their presence, their memory, their reality. Not with grand gestures, but with small nods, murmurs, and simple words. These signals may feel insignificant, but they carry weight. They tell someone, yes, I heard you. Yes, you exist in my memory as well as your own. And if you find yourself on the receiving end of omitted acknowledgement, recognize its effect. Silence is not always neutral. Sometimes it is the sharpest blade, cutting away at the roots of certainty. Because in the end, words are not only about expression, they are about survival. To speak and be acknowledged is to exist in the mind of another. To speak and be met with nothing is to risk erasure. Omitted acknowledgement is the quiet art of making someone doubt themselves, not by telling them they are wrong, but by leaving them to wonder if they were ever heard at all. Silent intimidation stare. Imagine sitting across from someone in a conversation. You've just said something. Maybe it's an explanation, maybe it's a request, and you expect a reply. But instead of answering, they simply stare. Their eyes lock on yours, unwavering, silent. No nod, no smile, no flicker of expression. Seconds tick by, stretching into an uncomfortable eternity. The air grows heavier, and you feel a strange pressure rising, not from words, but from the absence of them. That is the essence of the silent intimidation stare, a tactic that forces you to speak more than you intended, to justify yourself, to fill the silence, while the other person maintains the power of stillness. Humans are deeply social creatures, wired to interpret eye contact as meaning. A glance can signal interest, threat, dominance, or empathy. But when eye contact is prolonged without speech, it becomes unsettling. Our brains crave feedback in conversation, small cues like nods, or words of acknowledgement. When those cues vanish, we lose our sense of grounding. The silence feels accusatory, even if no accusation was made. The stare becomes a mirror, forcing us to question ourselves. Did I say the wrong thing? Do I need to explain more? Are they waiting for me to confess something I've hidden? This tactic is powerful in part because it weaponizes two psychological vulnerabilities: our discomfort with silence and our instinct to interpret eye contact as demand. Most people rush to break the tension, offering extra explanations, apologizing unnecessarily, or revealing more than they intended. The one holding the stare says nothing, and yet gains everything. They remain calm, composed, and dominant, while the other begins to unravel under the weight of their own overthinking. You see this in interrogations. Skilled investigators often use silence and eye contact more effectively than shouting. When a suspect offers an explanation, the interrogator may respond with nothing but a steady, unblinking stare. The silence draws out more details, often contradictions, because the suspect feels compelled to keep talking. It's not the question that breaks them, it's the absence of response. In everyday life, the silent intimidation stare surfaces in subtler ways. A boss listening to an employee's excuse may hold eye contact just long enough to make them squirm, nudging them to elaborate or confess weakness. A parent confronting a teenager might say nothing, letting the gaze alone pressure the child into stumbling admissions. Even in friendships or romantic relationships, someone can use silence and a stare to control the emotional tempo of a conflict, shifting the burden of speech onto the other. What makes it so unsettling is how primal it feels. In animal behavior, direct eye contact often signals threat or dominance. Predators stare down prey. Among primates, holding a gaze can provoke submission or aggression. Humans carry echoes of that wiring. A stare without warmth, without blinking, activates something ancient in us, something that whispers, "You are being judged. You are not safe." Yet not all stares are toxic. In some cultures, prolonged eye contact is a sign of respect, attention, or intimacy. Lovers gaze into each other's eyes in silence, and the stillness feels profound, not intimidating. Meditation practices even use eye contact as a way to dissolve barriers between self and other. The difference lies in intention. Is the silence offered as connection or as pressure? Is the gaze a bridge or a weapon? The silent intimidation stare reveals how fragile conversation really is. We like to believe words carry the power, but often it is timing, silence, and presence that shape outcomes. The person who can remain calm in silence, holding the gaze, exerts invisible pressure on the one who cannot. And the more you rush to escape that pressure, the more control you give away. So next time you feel trapped under someone's silent stare, resist the instinct to over-explain. Notice the silence, acknowledge its weight, but do not let it push you into surrender. And if you ever find yourself using it, ask whether you are creating space for thought, or simply using silence as a tool of domination. Because sometimes the most powerful statement is made not with words, but with the steady, unbroken stare that forces others to speak in your place. Delayed follow-up silence. Picture this. You've said something risky, an opinion, a confession, maybe even an accusation. You wait for the other person's reply. But instead of answering, they pause. Seconds pass. Then longer. The silence stretches into something uncomfortable, something sharp. You begin to second-guess yourself. Did you say too much? Did you cross a line? By the time they finally speak, their words carry a weight far greater than they would have if they had answered immediately. This is the psychological phenomenon of delayed follow-up silence. The use of pause as pressure, where holding back a response makes the eventual words land heavier, deeper, more unsettling. Silence is not empty. Neuroscience shows that gaps in conversation activate the same vigilance networks in the brain that respond to threat. When someone doesn't answer right away, your mind races to fill the void. You replay what you just said. You anticipate possible outcomes. You imagine hidden judgments forming in the quiet. In essence, you begin to argue against yourself. By the time the other person finally speaks, you are already on edge, primed for impact. The trick lies in contrast. Immediate replies feel lighter, almost casual. They come and go with the rhythm of conversation. But a response delayed by silence does not arrive on a neutral stage. It arrives on one charged with tension. The words that follow seem more deliberate, more considered, as though they were weighed carefully during the pause. Even a simple reply like, "I see," or "We'll talk later," can feel crushing when it arrives after silence. The pause itself does half the work, amplifying whatever comes next. Consider a manager in the workplace. An employee admits a mistake. Instead of scolding right away, the manager just sits quietly, staring, letting the silence crawl. The employee squirms, their mind filling with imagined consequences. Then, finally, the manager says, "We'll discuss this tomorrow." Those 6 words, after that silence, are more terrifying than an immediate lecture. The delay has transformed ordinary language into looming judgment. Or think of relationships. One partner confesses something painful, a lie, a doubt, a secret. The other does not reply immediately. Minutes pass in heavy quiet. And then, at last, "I don't know what to say." That statement, simple as it is, feels monumental because it was carried in on the weight of silence. Without the delay, it might sound ordinary. With it, it sounds like a verdict. The effect also appears in interrogations and negotiations. Police officers sometimes allow silence to stretch after a suspect's statement, knowing that the discomfort will push them to keep talking, to fill the gap with details they might not have revealed otherwise. Negotiators will sometimes pause after a proposal, letting the other side grow uneasy, until they blurt concessions just to end the stillness. Silence here is not weakness, it is strategy, turning inaction into leverage. What makes delayed follow-up silence so powerful is that it hijacks the human need for closure. Our brains crave resolution. When silence interrupts the expected rhythm of conversation, it creates a cognitive itch, an unresolved tension. We lean forward, waiting, craving the response. And when it finally arrives, no matter how short or simple, it satisfies that itch with disproportionate intensity. The silence made us hungry, and the words are devoured as though they are heavier, more important, more final. But there is a darker side too. This technique can be manipulative. Used in relationships, it can create fear, guilt, or dependence. Used in leadership, it can create an atmosphere of intimidation rather than respect. Silence, in this form, is not passive. It is active pressure, a way of controlling not only the flow of conversation but also the emotional state of the other person. The pause itself becomes a tool of power. And yet, silence is not inherently cruel. Sometimes, delayed response is simply honest. Sometimes words do need time to form. Sometimes silence gives space for reflection, preventing rash reactions. But regardless of intent, the effect is the same. When words finally arrive after silence, they carry more gravity. The brain interprets them as decisive, deliberate, even when they are not. So the next time you find yourself waiting in silence for someone's reply, notice how it changes you. Notice how the pause itself bends the air, tightens your chest, makes every second feel longer. And when the words finally come, recognize the trick your mind is playing. They feel heavier not only because of what was said, but because of what was not said. In conversation, silence is never neutral. It is pressure. It is anticipation. And when delayed words finally arrive, they land not as casual remarks but as blows, measured, sharpened, and unforgettable. Selective hearing silence. Imagine pouring your heart into a conversation. You've laid out your points carefully, your emotions raw, your reasoning sharp. The other person listens, nods, and then responds only to the parts they choose. The rest, the pieces that mattered most to you, vanish into silence. No acknowledgement, no rebuttal, just absence. This is selective hearing silence, a subtle but devastating tactic that shifts the balance of power in communication. It is not about mishearing. It is about choosing what deserves recognition, and by doing so, declaring control over the entire exchange. Humans rely on reciprocity in conversation. We expect what we say to be heard, processed, and answered. It is the unspoken contract of dialogue. When that contract is broken, when some words are strategically ignored, the effect is unnerving. It signals not only dismissal, but dominance. The person who decides what to respond to is silently saying, "I control the terms of this discussion. Your full voice does not matter." This tactic is used everywhere. In relationships, one partner may consistently miss the painful questions while addressing only the safer points, leaving the other stranded in frustration. In workplaces, leaders may respond only to comments that support their agenda while leaving criticisms unanswered, signaling which voices hold weight. In politics, debates are littered with selective hearing. Questions go unanswered, inconvenient truths left hanging in the air, while the speaker charges forward as though those words were never spoken. The silence itself becomes a weapon, bending the flow of conversation to their will. Psychologically, selective hearing silence exploits our need for acknowledgement. To speak and not be answered is to feel erased. The ignored points grow louder in the mind of the speaker, who begins repeating them, straining for recognition. The more they push, the more the tactic works, because the silence has already shifted the ground. The person ignoring has framed themselves as the arbiter of relevance, while the one ignored grows increasingly desperate, reactive, and powerless. This links to an uncomfortable truth: attention itself is power. To give attention is to validate, to withhold it is to diminish. By selectively answering only what suits them, the silencer rewrites the hierarchy of importance in real time. The ignored point, no matter how valid, begins to feel weaker simply because it was left unanswered. The tactic doesn't just suppress, it distorts perception of reality. Think of how this feels in an argument. You point out a painful hypocrisy, but the other person answers only your lighter remark, as if your main accusation never existed. Or in a meeting, you raise a critical concern, but the discussion pivots around you, leaving your point suspended in the void. The silence grows heavier than any spoken word, because it communicates something louder than disagreement. It communicates erasure. The effect ties into the psychology of social validation. We are wired to seek cues that our voices matter, that our words ripple into others' minds. When those cues vanish, insecurity takes root. The speaker may question their own clarity, their own relevance, even their own sanity. Was the point not worth answering? Did it even make sense? The silence undermines confidence at its core. And yet, for the one using it, selective hearing silence is efficient. It avoids confrontation. It redirects the conversation. It maintains control without raising a voice. It's why skilled negotiators, interrogators, and manipulators lean on it. They know that ignoring the right words at the right time is more destabilizing than arguing against them. A denial can be contested, but a silence leaves nothing to grasp. But this tactic, like all silences, comes at a cost. In personal relationships, it breeds resentment and mistrust. The person left unheard begins to withdraw, convinced that their voice carries no weight. Over time, communication collapses, not from shouting matches, but from carefully chosen silences. In workplaces or politics, it corrodes authenticity, leaving a trail of unspoken truths that eventually erupt elsewhere. The silence may win the moment, but it rarely wins the future. So the next time you find yourself in conversation and realize that your most important words were met with silence, recognize what is happening. It is not accident. It is not oversight. It is a form of control, an assertion of power over the rhythm of dialogue. And the silence itself is saying more than any words could. Only what I choose to hear matters. The vanishing reply. Imagine sending a message that matters to you. It could be a confession, a question, or even something as simple as a joke you hope will make the other person smile. You watch the screen, waiting for a response. A minute passes, then an hour, then a day. The reply never comes. The conversation does not end with closure. It simply vanishes, cut off midair, leaving you suspended in silence. And in that silence, your mind begins its restless work, replaying the last words over and over, searching for hidden meaning. This is the vanishing reply, a subtle but devastating psychological effect where the sudden absence of response forces the other person into overthinking, self-doubt, and endless reinterpretation. Human communication thrives on rhythm. A message sent, a message received. A statement answered, an expression acknowledged. Each exchange builds a chain, a continuity that reassures both sides that they are connected. But when the chain breaks without warning, the rhythm collapses. The one left waiting feels abandoned not by the words themselves, but by the silence where words should have been. It is not just the absence of reply, it is the absence of closure. And the mind, craving completion, tries desperately to supply it. Psychologists call this the Zeigarnik effect, the tendency for unfinished tasks to occupy the mind more than completed ones. A conversation that ends naturally can be set aside. But one that ends abruptly, without resolution, lingers like a ghost. The brain circles it endlessly, trying to tie off the thread. Did I say something wrong? Were they offended? Did they lose interest? The questions multiply, and with no answers, insecurity grows. The vanishing reply is powerful not because of what it says, but because of what it refuses to say. Think of how this plays out in relationships. Someone you care about suddenly stops replying mid-conversation. Hours later, you find yourself rereading your last message, analyzing every word, as if meaning lies hidden in punctuation or tone. You imagine scenarios. Maybe they are busy, maybe they are upset, maybe they are gone for good. Each possibility carries weight, and because silence gives you nothing, you carry them all. The vanishing reply forces you into a conversation with yourself, one that is often harsher than anything the other person would have said. In friendships, this effect creates distance. In romance, it creates heartbreak. In professional settings, it creates anxiety. An email with no reply leaves you doubting your worth. A question ignored in a meeting leaves you uncertain of your standing. Silence becomes louder than words, because it is empty of meaning yet full of implication. The vanishing reply is not neutral, it is charged, a void that demands to be filled by the insecurities of the one left waiting. And sometimes, it is deliberate. People use the vanishing reply as a form of power, knowing that silence destabilizes more than critique. By ending a conversation abruptly, they force the other person to shoulder the weight of interpretation. It is a tactic of control, a subtle form of psychological pressure. The one who withholds the reply holds the power. The one who waits is left vulnerable, exposed to their own doubts. But just as often, the vanishing is unintentional. A message left unanswered because of distraction, exhaustion, or forgetfulness can still carry the same effect. The sender does not know the difference. To them, the silence feels loaded with meaning, whether or not meaning was intended. That is the cruelty of the vanishing reply. It punishes even when it is innocent. At its core, this phenomenon reveals how fragile communication truly is. We imagine words are enough, but words only live when they are acknowledged. A message without a reply is like a seed without soil, full of potential, but cut off from growth. The silence does not merely pause the conversation. It kills it. And yet, in the mind of the one left waiting, it refuses to die, replaying endlessly in search of an ending that will never come. There is a haunting beauty in this fragility. The discomfort of the vanishing reply shows how deeply we long for connection, how much we depend on acknowledgement to anchor our sense of self. Without that acknowledgement, we drift. The silence becomes a mirror that reflects our fears, our insecurities, our need to be seen. The reply that never comes reveals not only the other person's absence, but our own vulnerability. So the next time you find yourself staring at a message with no response, notice what happens inside you. Notice the spiral of overthinking, the way silence becomes louder than speech. That is the vanishing reply at work, the abrupt end that never feels like an ending. And remember, sometimes the loudest words are the ones never spoken, and the deepest wounds are made not by what was said, but by what was withheld. Timed absence strategy. Imagine reaching out to someone, sending a message, making a call, trying to set a meeting, and they are not there. Minutes stretch, then hours. You wait, refreshing the chat, checking your phone, rehearsing what you'll say when they reply. Finally, when the response comes, it carries more weight than it would have if it arrived instantly. Why? Because in their absence, anticipation grew. Attention became scarce, and scarcity breeds value. This is the essence of the timed absence strategy. Choosing moments to be unavailable not by accident, but by design, to amplify the impact of your presence when you return. Humans are wired to notice gaps. In social life, absence is not a void, it is a message. When someone is always present, always available, their attention risks being taken for granted. But when they disappear at calculated moments, silence itself becomes part of the communication. The mind of the other begins to fill the gap. Why aren't they answering? What are they doing? When will they return? The unanswered question loops, increasing the perceived significance of the person who withholds. When the attention finally arrives, it feels earned, and thus more precious. This strategy can be seen across many domains. In relationships, a partner who sometimes steps back from constant interaction creates space for the other to lean forward. The absence is not abandonment but contrast, highlighting their presence when it returns. In leadership, a manager who doesn't weigh in on every minor decision but chooses moments of absence makes their eventual input more authoritative. Their words feel scarcer, and therefore more valuable. Even in art and performance, timed absence has power. A musician pausing before the chorus, a speaker letting silence stretch before the reveal, a storyteller holding back a critical detail until the exact right moment. The gap sharpens attention. Scarcity is one of the oldest levers of human psychology. We are drawn to what feels limited, whether it is rare objects, fleeting opportunities, or unavailable people. The timed absence strategy exploits this bias. By withholding presence at certain moments, one creates the perception that attention is not cheap, not infinite, but worth waiting for. This transforms even ordinary interaction into something charged with significance. But the strategy is double-edged. When applied with intention and care, it builds intrigue, respect, even desire. When abused, it becomes manipulation, ghosting, stonewalling, or withholding affection as a form of control. The difference lies in motive and balance. Healthy absence is rhythmic. It creates space, then returns with warmth. Unhealthy absence is punitive. It withholds without explanation, leaving the other anxious, diminished, or trapped in uncertainty. Consider the delicate balance of timing. Too brief an absence, and it goes unnoticed. Too long, and it breeds resentment instead of appreciation. The power lies in proportion, in knowing when to step back just enough for the other to feel the gap without doubting the bond. In this way, timed absence is not silence, it is punctuation. It shapes the rhythm of connection, guiding attention by when it is withheld as much as by when it is offered. The strategy also reveals something profound about human connection. That attention is a currency. We spend it, we hoard it, we measure our worth by how much of it we receive. To be constantly available is to flood the market, to devalue the very currency we wish to share. To withhold strategically is to remind others, and ourselves, that our attention has weight, that it is something to be noticed, something to be valued. Think of the moments in your own life where absence spoke louder than words. The mentor who delayed their feedback until the right moment, making it land like a revelation. The friend who didn't reply immediately, making their eventual message more impactful. The performer who let silence hang in the room, making the next note unforgettable. In each case, absence was not neglect, it was design. It made presence matter more. So the next time you feel pressure to always be available, consider the timed absence strategy. Ask yourself, what if stepping back could make your return more powerful? What if not answering immediately gave your words more weight? What if absence itself could speak? Used wisely, it does not diminish connection, it deepens it. Because attention, like all scarce resources, shines brightest when it is R.A. Deliberate group silence. Imagine stepping into a room full of people. A meeting, a classroom, a dinner table, it doesn't matter. You say something, maybe a suggestion, maybe a joke, maybe just a casual comment. And instead of a response, no laughter, no acknowledgement, no words, you are met with silence. Dozens of eyes on you, yet not a single sound. The group remains quiet, deliberately so, and in that stillness you begin to feel the weight of something invisible pressing down. That is the power of deliberate group silence, a tactic that isolates, destabilizes, and makes you question your place among others. Humans are wired to seek feedback in groups. Every nod, smile, or chuckle tells you that you belong, that your voice is recognized. Silence, in contrast, feels like rejection. A group's refusal to respond doesn't just mean we disagree, it feels like you are outside. The brain interprets this as a kind of social exile, triggering stress responses that can be as sharp as physical pain. Neuroscience shows that social exclusion activates the same neural pathways as bodily injury. When an entire group withholds response, the pain is magnified. This tactic often appears in subtle ways. In workplaces, colleagues may exchange glances but stay silent when one person shares an idea, leaving them stranded in discomfort. In classrooms, peers may deliberately withhold acknowledgement of a student's answer to underline their difference. Among friends, a joke told to silence can feel like humiliation. And in families, a child's voice ignored at the dinner table creates an unspoken hierarchy of who matters and who doesn't. The silence itself is rarely neutral. It can be intentional, a group silently agreeing to ostracize someone, a method of signaling disapproval without words. Or it can be performative, where the silence is less about disagreement and more about power. We will not give you the dignity of response. Either way, the effect is chilling. The target is left to fill the void, often by apologizing, backtracking, or retreating into self-doubt. The group says nothing, but the silence says everything. What makes deliberate group silence especially effective is its asymmetry. One person against many. One voice against a wall of quiet. The imbalance creates psychological pressure, because the individual cannot fight silence with words. The more they speak, the deeper the isolation feels, as though they are performing to an audience that refuses to clap. This pressure is not just about embarrassment, it's about control. The group demonstrates its collective power to withhold recognition, reducing the individual's presence to something smaller, almost invisible. You see this in interrogation rooms, where multiple officers may sit quietly while one speaks, amplifying the sense of scrutiny. You see it in politics, when a speech is met with stony silence rather than applause, weaponizing absence to communicate disdain. You see it in bullying, where the silent treatment is scaled up from one person to many, turning social exclusion into a public spectacle. And yet, silence is not always cruel. In some contexts, group silence can be respectful. Moments of collective stillness in memory of the dead, silence during rituals, silence as a way of granting space for thought. The same mechanism that isolates can also unite, depending on intention. The line between reverence and rejection lies in whether the silence feels shared or imposed. But when wielded as a tactic of isolation, deliberate group silence cuts deep. It makes the target hyper-aware of every movement, every breath, every word they speak. It forces them into the role of outsider, even if no one explicitly says so. And the cruelty of it lies in deniability. After all, no one said anything. The group can claim innocence, but the target still feels the wound. The lesson is haunting. Power does not always come from words. Sometimes it comes from withholding them. A group's choice to remain silent can speak louder than any insult, stripping someone of belonging, dignity, and confidence without uttering a sound. So the next time you find yourself in that eerie quiet, remember, silence is not emptiness. It is a message. And sometimes, the loudest judgment you will ever face is the sound of nothing at all. Interruption with silence. Imagine this. You're speaking, building your argument, your rhythm carrying you forward. The words flow, and you feel the momentum gathering. And then, it happens. Someone interrupts. But not with words. Not with a correction, a question, or a challenge. They interrupt with silence. They stop you mid-sentence, their body language signaling a cut, their presence exerting pressure. But nothing is said. Suddenly, your train of thought derails. The silence itself becomes the interruption. And in that pause, the control of the conversation shifts entirely. This tactic is unsettling because conversation depends on rhythm. We expect interruptions to have sound, to push back with language. When an interruption arrives wordlessly, the brain scrambles to make sense of it. Did they not understand? Did they disapprove? Are they waiting for something? The uncertainty is what makes it powerful. Instead of defending yourself against an explicit challenge, you are left suspended, your momentum shattered, your focus scattered. You're forced to fill the silence yourself, and in doing so, you often lose confidence, coherence, or both. It works because humans are wired to complete gaps. Silence in the middle of dialogue is like an unfinished melody. The mind aches to resolve it, and in that aching, composure begins to crack. Imagine being on stage, telling a story, and someone in the front row raises their hand as if to interject, but says nothing. Instantly, your rhythm falters. You stumble, wondering whether to stop, continue, or address them. The silence has spoken louder than words. In negotiations, this technique can be brutal. A person lays out their proposal, and midway through, the other side interrupts, not with counter-arguments, but with silence. They lean back, fold their arms, and just wait. The speaker feels the weight of the pause, begins to backpedal, revise, soften their own position. The silence becomes a mirror, forcing them to hear the weakness in their own words. They collapse under pressure not because of attack, but because of absence. Even in personal relationships, interruption with silence leaves scars. A partner begins to explain themselves passionately, desperately, and the other person cuts them off by refusing to respond. The silence says, "I don't believe you. I don't want to hear more. I am closing this down." The one speaking suddenly feels exposed, as if their words are floating in a vacuum with no one to catch them. The silence undermines their voice more effectively than shouting ever could. This tactic works because power in conversation is not about who speaks the most, it's about who controls the flow. By cutting someone off without a word, you seize the tempo, you force a reset. The other person's mind, left hanging, must scramble to recover. And the longer the silence stretches, the more their confidence withers. What was once smooth becomes fragmented. What was once confident becomes self-conscious. There is also a psychological sting. When interrupted by words, you can argue back. You can clarify, defend, fight. But when interrupted by silence, you are denied even that outlet. You are left suspended in ambiguity, unable to push against anything solid. The silence becomes an immovable wall, and you feel smaller standing before it. But like all forms of silence, this tactic carries double edges. It can be manipulative, yes, but it can also reveal truths. Sometimes when someone interrupts with silence, it is not strategy but shock. They are so struck by what was said that they cannot respond. In that moment, the silence itself becomes an honest reflection, heavier than words. The speaker feels the void and knows instinctively, their words carried consequences. Still, as a deliberate tool, interruption with silence is among the most disarming of conversational weapons. It is control without aggression, dominance without noise. It takes away the speaker's breath, their momentum, their certainty, and leaves them stranded in the quiet. So the next time you're speaking and someone cuts you off, not with words, but with nothing at all, pay attention to the way it derails you. Notice how the silence feels like a blade, sharper than argument. And remember, in conversation, noise is not the only way to command. Sometimes the absence of sound is the loudest interruption of all. Silence as endorsement. Imagine sitting in a meeting. One person makes a bold claim, controversial, maybe even dangerous. The room falls quiet. No one speaks up. Seconds pass, then minutes. The statement lingers in the air, unchallenged. And slowly, something subtle but powerful takes hold. Silence itself begins to look like agreement. This is the phenomenon of silence as endorsement, a psychological dynamic where saying nothing becomes louder than speaking, reshaping group behavior without a single word. Human beings are deeply social creatures. We take cues not only from what people say, but from what they don't say. A nod can be support, but so can the absence of objection. In a group, silence carries a weight far heavier than neutrality. It can be mistaken for consent, compliance, even approval. And because of that, silence is rarely neutral at all. It tilts the balance of perception, turning uncertainty into seeming consensus. Consider how this works in real life. In a classroom, a teacher makes an unfair remark about a student. No one objects. To the student, that silence feels like the whole room agrees. In workplaces, a leader proposes a risky idea, and nobody raises a concern. The absence of dissent emboldens the leader, who interprets quiet as approval. In politics, when harmful rhetoric goes unchallenged, the crowd's silence becomes a stage, amplifying the speaker's voice as if it represents the will of many. This effect is tied to what psychologists call pluralistic ignorance, when individuals privately disagree but stay silent, assuming that others accept the statement. Everyone thinks they are alone in dissent, so no one speaks, and silence itself creates a false majority. What was once a single opinion becomes the group's apparent stance, not through persuasion, but through absence of opposition. The danger of silence as endorsement is how it shifts responsibility. The speaker gains power without earning it. The bystanders lose power without realizing it. And the victim, or the person most affected, feels abandoned, isolated, even betrayed. Silence does not simply sit in the background. It reshapes the reality of the room. But the tactic can also be wielded deliberately. Skilled negotiators or leaders sometimes say something provocative, then wait. If no one objects, they frame the silence as agreement, moving forward with greater authority. In this way, silence becomes a rhetorical trap, forcing others to either actively oppose or be swept along by implied consent. It is less about truth and more about perception. Yet silence is ambiguous. It may mean agreement, but it may also mean fear, shock, hesitation, or strategy. Still, in social settings, ambiguity is dangerous because it gets interpreted by the one who speaks loudest. And often, that interpretation becomes the narrative. Silence, then, is not simply nothing. It is a blank canvas others will paint on. This phenomenon explains why cultures and communities collapse under unchallenged voices. Injustice grows not only through active harm, but through passive acceptance. Silence becomes the soil in which harmful ideas take root, because the lack of resistance makes them appear natural, normal, endorsed. History is filled with moments when silence was as destructive as speech, when not speaking gave power to the wrong side. And in personal life, too, the effect can cut deep. Imagine confiding in a friend, revealing something vulnerable, and receiving only silence in return. The lack of words doesn't feel neutral. It feels like judgment, or worse, agreement with your fears. The mind fills silence with meaning, and that meaning often cuts sharper than any reply. Silence as endorsement is both a warning and a mirror. A warning, because leaving false ideas unchallenged can allow them to harden into reality. A mirror, because it shows us how often we retreat into quiet, convincing ourselves that not speaking is harmless, when in truth, it is participation by omission. So the next time a statement lingers in the air and silence follows, remember, silence is not always safety. Sometimes it is complicity. Sometimes it is consent. And sometimes it is the loudest endorsement of all. Sleep on it, silence. Imagine sitting across a table in the middle of tense negotiations. The air is heavy with offers, counteroffers, and the invisible pressure of who will break first. Hours of back and forth have led to a fragile place, a moment where you expect an answer. You lean forward, waiting for their decision. But instead of replying, the other side closes their folder, rises from the chair, and says, "Let's continue tomorrow." Just like that, the discussion is ended. No confirmation, no rejection, no sign of where things stand. And suddenly, the battle shifts. The silence of the night becomes the battlefield. This is the power of sleep on its silence, deliberately pausing negotiations overnight to let the other party stew in uncertainty, amplifying doubt and softening resistance. Human psychology craves closure. When a conflict is left unresolved, the mind cannot simply set it aside. It replays the conversation in loops, analyzing every phrase, searching for meaning in what was said, and in what was left unsaid. As the hours stretch, insecurity begins to grow. Did I push too hard? Did my offer seem weak? Did I ruin the deal? While one side sleeps peacefully, the other lies awake, haunted by questions with no answers. The silence, stretched across the long hours of the night, becomes more persuasive than any argument spoken at the table. Negotiators understand this well. An abrupt pause at a critical moment transfers the weight of uncertainty to the other party. Instead of clarity, they are left with ambiguity. And ambiguity is fertile ground for anxiety. By the time the meeting resumes, many people, desperate to escape the discomfort of stewing overnight, become more willing to compromise, to soften demands, to seek relief in agreement. Sleep on its silence is not just a delay. It is a tactic of psychological pressure disguised as patience. Think of how it works in personal life. An argument with a partner that ends abruptly at night does not disappear. Each side lies in bed, their minds replaying the last words. The silence does not soothe, it sharpens. The unresolved tension festers in the dark, magnifying insecurities. By morning, the urge to repair often overwhelms the urge to resist. Silence, stretched over time, becomes persuasion. This is not only about relationships or business. It is about the way the brain handles uncertainty. When left with unfinished problems, the mind enters a state of mental rumination. Instead of resting, it rehashes, speculates, and imagines. Sleep, which normally resets and restores, becomes disrupted. Dreams themselves may bend around the unresolved tension. In this way, the tactic works not just in the conscious mind but seeps into the unconscious, ensuring the silence is never truly silent. The cruelty of sleep on it silence lies in its invisibility. It appears rational, even wise. Let's not rush, let's take the night to think. On the surface, it looks like prudence. But beneath the surface, it weaponizes time. The one who initiates the pause maintains control. They sleep knowing they have planted seeds of doubt. The other spends the night watering those seeds with worry. By morning, one side is steady, the other already weakened. And yet, there is a paradox here. Sometimes the silence backfires. Given too much time, the other party may harden their position, consulting allies or gathering new strategies. What was meant as pressure can become preparation. The tactic only works when uncertainty outweighs confidence, when insecurity outweighs resolve. In skilled hands, however, the balance tips reliably, turning silence into a weapon sharper than words. At its core, Sleep on It silence reveals something fundamental about human nature. We fear unfinished stories. We crave resolution, and when resolution is withheld, we create it ourselves, often to our own disadvantage. The pause becomes louder than speech, the delay heavier than action. It shows that negotiation is not only about numbers, contracts, or logic, it is about psychology. And in psychology, silence stretched overnight can be the most devastating move of all. So the next time someone ends a negotiation with, "We'll continue tomorrow," pay attention to the storm that follows inside you. Notice how the silence creeps into your thoughts, how it grows larger with each passing hour. That is Sleep on It silence at work, the invisible pressure that makes the night itself part of the negotiation. And remember, sometimes the most powerful argument is not the one spoken at the table, but the one whispered in your own mind while you wait for morning. Freeze out punishment. Imagine walking into a room where someone you know well sits across from you. You speak to them, but they do not answer. You ask again, a little louder, but still, nothing. Their eyes avoid yours, their posture stays rigid, and the air between you thickens with a silence that is deliberate. Hours pass, maybe even days, and every word you offer meets the same wall. This is not ordinary quiet. It is a weaponized absence. This is the freeze-out punishment, the sustained silence directed at another person, not out of forgetfulness or distraction, but as an act of control, disapproval, or retribution. Unlike verbal criticism, which is sharp and visible, freeze-out punishment cuts invisibly. There are no insults to quote, no arguments to replay. Instead, the wound comes from the void itself. Human beings are social creatures wired to crave acknowledgement. A nod, a word, even a sigh signals that we exist in another's perception. But when silence is prolonged, when recognition is withheld, the message is devastating. You are not worth my words, you do not exist in my world right now. That message, though unspoken, can hurt more than the cruelest phrase. The psychology behind this is stark. Social rejection triggers the same neural circuits as physical pain. Brain imaging shows that being excluded activates areas like the anterior cingulate cortex, the same regions lit up when you burn your hand or cut your skin. Freeze-out punishment, then, is not just uncomfortable. It is literally painful, as if silence were striking nerves like blows. And the pain is magnified by ambiguity. When someone yells at you, you know their anger. When someone ignores you, you are left to guess, to question endlessly. What did I do? Why won't they speak? Will this end? The uncertainty gnaws deeper than criticism ever could. This strategy often appears in intimate relationships. A partner might deploy the silent treatment after a conflict, withdrawing completely to make the other suffer. Parents sometimes use it with children, not realizing that ignoring them communicates not discipline but rejection. In workplaces, colleagues or leaders can freeze out someone as a way of expressing disapproval or asserting dominance. The result is isolation. The target feels invisible, destabilized, and desperate to regain connection. Many eventually break down, apologizing or conceding even when they are not at fault, just to end the silence. In this way, freeze-out punishment becomes a tool of control. And yet, part of what makes it so haunting is its deniability. If accused, the person wielding silence can always say, "I just needed space," or "I wasn't in the mood to talk." Unlike shouted words, silence leaves no evidence. It is an absence disguised as neutrality. but the person on the receiving end knows the difference. They feel the intent, the weight, the punishment embedded in that void. Silence without warmth is never neutral. It is heavy, oppressive, and calculated. There are moments, of course, when silence can be healthy. A pause to calm down, space to gather thoughts, a moment of reflection before speaking. But freeze-out punishment is not this. It is silence prolonged beyond reason, sharpened into a blade. It is less about cooling tempers and more about asserting power through withdrawal. Where healthy silence heals, freeze-out corrodes. The long-term effects can be severe. Targets of sustained silence often develop anxiety, hypervigilance, and self-doubt. They replay interactions, searching for mistakes. They learn to fear conflict, not because of explosive arguments, but because of the chilling aftermath. Some even lose their sense of self-worth, internalizing the idea that their voice, their presence, does not matter. Over time, freeze-out punishment doesn't just end a conversation, it reshapes identity. And yet, in its cruelty, the freeze-out reveals something profound about human nature. It shows how deeply we depend on acknowledgement, how fragile our sense of existence becomes without it. To be seen, to be heard, to be answered, these are not luxuries, but necessities of being human. Take them away, and even the strongest person begins to wither. So the next time you are tempted to punish with silence, remember its weight. Ask yourself, does this absence guide, or does it wound? Does it build space for healing, or does it carve deeper divides? And if you ever find yourself frozen out, remember that the silence says more about the one withholding it than about you. Their silence is not proof of your unworthiness, but of their choice to weaponize absence. Because in the end, silence is never empty. It always carries meaning. And when it is prolonged, when it becomes a freeze-out, its meaning is unmistakable. Punishment, sharper than words, more painful than sound. Non-reaction wall. Imagine someone tries to provoke you. Maybe they raise their voice, insult you, or toss out a pointed remark designed to sting. Their eyes lock on yours, waiting for the reaction. For anger, for defense, for hurt. But you give them nothing. No flinch, no frown, no rise in tone. You remain calm, unshaken, almost as if their words evaporated in the air. What follows is a shift they did not expect. Their fuel runs out, their tactic collapses. This is the essence of the non-reaction wall, a psychological defense that denies an aggressor the emotional payoff they crave. Human conflict often thrives not on the words themselves, but on the reactions they provoke. An insult only bites if it hooks into anger. A taunt only works if it pulls you into defense. When someone sets out to provoke, they are not simply throwing words at you, they are setting bait. They want to see you take it, to watch you flail, to gain control through your response. By refusing to react, you dismantle the trap. You take away the very oxygen their fire needs to burn. This tactic is powerful because it flips the emotional script. Most aggressors expect escalation. If they push, you push back. When instead they meet a calm, impassive wall, they are left stranded with their own energy, with nowhere for it to go. The silence, the lack of visible response, becomes heavier than any counterattack. It forces them to confront the futility of their tactic. Consider how this plays out in daily life. In the workplace, a colleague might use sarcasm to undermine you in a meeting. If you snap back, you risk looking unprofessional, feeding their narrative. But if you remain unshaken, acknowledging them with neutrality and moving forward, the barb falls flat. In family disputes, a relative may try to pull you into old arguments. If you refuse to rise to the bait, the cycle breaks. Even in relationships, when one partner tries to provoke jealousy or guilt, the non-reaction wall makes the tactic lose power. Psychologically, this approach exploits a simple truth. Provocation requires reciprocity. Without feedback, the loop collapses. Think of it like a comedian performing to silence. Jokes fall flat not because of the words themselves, but because the audience refuses to provide the laughter that would validate them. Similarly, provocateurs thrive on visible impact, raised voices, defensive explanations, emotional cracks. When these vanish, they are left exposed, performing to a wall. But the non-reaction wall is not about coldness for its own sake. It requires composure, not indifference. The goal is not to shut down all communication, but to refuse engagement on unfair terms. It is about refusing to reward manipulation with the response it seeks. Over time, this often forces the aggressor to abandon the tactic altogether, because it no longer achieves its purpose. Of course, building such a wall is difficult. Human nature craves retaliation, recognition, the urge to defend ourselves. Staying calm under provocation feels unnatural, even painful, because silence in the face of attack can be misread as weakness. But in truth, it takes more strength to withhold reaction than to lash out. The wall is not passive, it is active restraint, a deliberate choice to control the game rather than be pulled into it. History and culture offer countless echoes of this principle. Protest movements have used non-reaction, standing firm, silent, unyielding, in the face of aggression, making the violence of the aggressor stand out more starkly. Negotiators in high-stakes diplomacy often respond to provocation with silence, refusing to be baited into concessions. Even in martial arts, the principle appears: let the opponent exhaust themselves against the wall you create, until their power dissolves into nothing. The non-reaction wall reveals something deeper about power. It shows that control in conflict is not always about striking harder, but about choosing not to be moved. It is about realizing that your reaction is the currency aggressors are trying to steal, and that withholding it keeps you rich. So the next time someone throws bait at you, pause before you bite. Ask yourself, what if I gave them nothing? What if their words shattered against a wall of calm? The answer, unsettling yet liberating, is that you would see the true power of silence, not weakness, but mastery. Question without answer. Imagine you're in the middle of a conversation, steady, composed, your words flowing. Then someone turns to you, looks directly into your eyes, and asks a question. Not just any question. A sharp one, a loaded one, something that cuts straight into the heart of the matter. And then, nothing. No explanation, no follow-up, no guiding tone. Just silence. The weight of the question sits between you like a stone. Suddenly, you feel compelled to fill the void. You start explaining, defending, justifying, often saying far more than you ever intended. This is the power of the question without answer, the psychological trap that turns silence into a weapon and forces people to unravel themselves. It works because questions are open loops. When someone asks one, your mind instinctively wants closure. A question without response is like an itch that must be scratched. If the asker stays silent, your brain takes over the burden of resolution. You scramble to fill the gap, to provide enough explanation to satisfy the invisible demand. And the longer the silence stretches, the more your words spill out, each attempt to close the loop making you sound weaker, less certain, more vulnerable. Interrogators know this trick well. A detective might lean in and ask, "Why did you leave the party early that night?" Then they fall silent. The suspect, unable to bear the quiet, keeps talking, piling on details, stumbling into contradictions. The detective didn't need to press. The silence, following the question, did all the pressing for them. Negotiators use it too. Imagine you propose a price in a business deal. The other side simply asks, "Why that number?" Then they go quiet. The silence gnaws at you. You start justifying, listing costs, admitting flexibility, even lowering your own offer, just to fill the space. Their silence pulled you into giving away leverage you didn't need to surrender. Even in personal life, the question without answer can cut deep. A partner might ask, "Do you really mean that?" Then they say nothing more. The silence forces you to re-examine your own words. You begin clarifying, backtracking, over-explaining, until your original statement collapses under its own weight. Or a parent might simply ask a child, "Is that the truth?" and then fall silent. The child squirms, caught not by accusation, but by the space that follows. The psychological mechanics here are simple but devastating. Silence after a loaded question magnifies uncertainty. It creates a void that demands to be filled, and humans are deeply uncomfortable leaving it empty. The speaker, desperate to resolve the imbalance, overcompensates. They spill information, weaken their stance, sometimes even confess unintentionally. In this way, the question without answer is not just a query, it's a trapdoor. Once you step on it, the silence beneath you opens wide. What makes it especially powerful is the illusion of control. The person asking the question barely speaks, yet they dominate the exchange. The respondent, by contrast, ends up doing all the work, talking, explaining, exposing themselves. The silence after the question functions like an invisible rope, pulling the other deeper with every word. But here's the paradox. This tactic only works because of our natural drive for connection. Humans read silence not as nothing, but as loaded meaning. We assume the other person is judging, waiting, expecting. That assumption forces us to overcompensate. In truth, the silence might contain nothing. But our minds cannot resist filling it with pressure, and in doing so, we betray ourselves. So the next time someone asks you a question and then says nothing more, notice the pull. Notice how quickly you want to keep talking, to over-explain, to satisfy the invisible demand. And remember, silence is not neutral. After a loaded question, silence is power. It is the weight of judgment, the sting of expectation, the invisible hand guiding you to reveal more than you intended. The question without answer doesn't need to accuse, doesn't need to challenge. It only needs to wait. And in the waiting, it wins. Confident stage silence. Picture this: a speaker walks onto a stage. The crowd stirs, whispers ripple, all eyes turn. But the speaker doesn't begin right away. Instead, they stop, stand tall, and allow silence to settle over the room. For a moment, nothing is said. The pause stretches longer than expected. The audience leans in, waiting, almost holding their breath. And then, when the speaker finally begins, every word lands with amplified force. This is confident stage silence, the art of using pause not as absence, but as presence, a tool that magnifies authority and commands attention. Most people fear silence in public speaking. The instinct is to fill every second, to avoid gaps that might feel awkward or expose nerves. But in reality, silence is one of the most powerful tools a speaker can wield. When you pause deliberately, especially at the start, you send a signal. I am in control. You show that you don't need to rush, you don't need to scramble, because you own the space. The audience senses this confidence, and their perception of your authority rises instantly. Psychologists have studied this effect. Human attention naturally spikes at transitions, when something ends, when something begins, or when expectation is broken. A pause interrupts the rhythm, creating tension. The brain, craving resolution, tunes in more sharply. Silence becomes a spotlight, illuminating the words that follow. And in the theater of public speaking, that spotlight is priceless. Think of the greatest leaders and performers. Martin Luther King Jr., pausing before delivering, "I have a dream." Barack Obama, allowing silence to stretch between sentences so the weight of his words could settle. Even comedians know this instinctively, timing the silence before a punchline so that when it lands, the laughter explodes louder. Silence is not a gap in performance. It is performance. The effect also ties to authority. When someone rushes their speech, filling space with nervous chatter, the audience senses insecurity. But when someone pauses calmly, they project dominance. It is the same in conversation. The person most comfortable with silence often holds the upper hand. On stage, that principle multiplies. A speaker who can pause without panic proves they are not just delivering words, but orchestrating the entire atmosphere. And the pause doesn't just work at the beginning. Strategic silences throughout a speech give the audience time to absorb meaning. After a powerful statement, a pause allows the weight of the words to sink in. After a rhetorical question, silence invites reflection, pulling the audience into the conversation. Instead of rushing them along, you give them space to feel. And in that space, connection deepens. But perhaps the most fascinating element is how silence shifts perception of time. A pause that feels endless to the speaker, 3, 4, 5 seconds, feels shorter to the audience and more deliberate. What feels like vulnerability on the inside radiates as confidence on the outside. The speaker is not lost. They are commanding patience. Of course, the tactic must be used wisely. Too much silence risks awkwardness, disconnection, even irritation. But when timed with purpose, silence becomes rhythm, pacing, punctuation. It turns a speech into music, where words are the notes and pauses the rests that make melody possible. Confident stage silence reveals a deeper truth about communication. Power is not only in what is said, but in what is withheld. Authority is not only in the voice, but in the space around it. The audience doesn't just listen to your words, they listen to your silence, and from it, they draw meaning. So the next time you stand before a crowd, remember, you don't need to rush into speech to prove your worth. Let the silence work for you. Hold it, own it, make the audience lean in. And when you finally speak, your words will not just be heard, they will be felt. Subtle clock watching. Imagine speaking to someone who seems attentive. You're explaining, sharing, maybe even opening up. And then, without warning, their eyes flick downward toward their watch or the clock on the wall. They say nothing. They don't interrupt. But the gesture, silent and subtle, slices into the conversation. Suddenly, every word you speak feels heavier, rushed, less important. You begin to question yourself. Am I talking too much? Am I boring them? Should I stop? This is the effect of subtle clock watching, an unspoken signal that conveys impatience, pressure, and dominance without a single word being spoken. Human communication runs on more than language. Every glance, every gesture, every pause carries weight. A nod encourages, a smile reassures, a frown warns. But some gestures are sharper precisely because they are ambiguous. Looking at the time is one of them. It can be innocent, even reflexive, but in the wrong moment, it speaks volumes. It tells the other person that your time matters more than their words. It reminds them that every second is slipping away, and that they are the one consuming it. Psychologists have long studied the subtle cues of dominance in conversation. Silence itself can create pressure, but silence paired with a glance at the clock magnifies it. It forces the speaker into self-consciousness, pushing them to edit, shorten, or abandon their message altogether. The effect is rarely acknowledged out loud, but it is deeply felt. In that single motion of checking the time, authority shifts. The one who looks at the clock silently asserts control. The one who notices it becomes subordinate, forced to accommodate the signal. Think of how this plays out in the workplace. An employee presents an idea to their manager. Halfway through, the manager glances at their watch. No words are spoken, no critique is given, but the message lands with brutal clarity. You are taking too long. My time is more valuable than your thoughts. The employee feels the pressure, shortens their explanation, and leaves the meeting questioning the worth of their contribution. A simple flick of the eyes has reshaped the entire exchange. In relationships, the effect can be just as corrosive. A partner glancing at the clock during an argument sends an unspoken signal. This is dragging on. I want it to end. The words themselves may continue, but the emotional weight has shifted. The partner who saw the glance now feels dismissed, their concerns reduced to an inconvenience measured in minutes. The damage is not in what was said, but in what was silently implied. And yet, the power of subtle clock watching is not only in impatience, it is also in dominance. The one who checks the time reminds everyone else that they control the rhythm. It is a subtle hierarchy. Their schedule defines the limits, their awareness of time overrides the flow of the conversation. Even when unintended, this gesture can create an imbalance, tilting the exchange in their favor. There are moments when this tactic is deliberate. Negotiators may glance at the clock to signal dwindling patience, forcing the other side to rush into concessions. Leaders may do it in meetings to assert control without speaking a word. Parents may use it with children to silently press urgency. The beauty and the cruelty of subtle clock watching is that it hides behind plausibility. If confronted, the person can always say, "I was just checking the time." But the damage has already been done. What makes it so powerful is the way it exploits human insecurity. We all want to feel that our words matter, that our presence is worth someone else's attention. When the clock enters the conversation, it reminds us that attention is finite, fragile, easily withdrawn. Suddenly, we are no longer speaking into connection. We are speaking against the ticking of time. And no one wants to be the one who overstays their welcome. But there is also a paradox. Sometimes, subtle clock watching reveals more about the watcher than the speaker. It exposes impatience, distraction, or even disrespect. A truly attentive listener rarely glances at time. A leader secure in their authority doesn't need to remind others of it through gestures. And yet, because of the way humans are wired to detect even the smallest signals, the glance rarely goes unnoticed. It lands like a whisper of rejection, a reminder that time is more valued than presence. So the next time you are speaking and see someone check the clock, notice what happens inside you. Notice how quickly doubt creeps in, how the rhythm of your words falters, how urgency replaces calm. That is the silent power of subtle clock watching, the gesture that turns seconds into pressure and silence into dominance. And remember this, sometimes the smallest glance is louder than the strongest voice, and sometimes the measure of time is not in hours or minutes, but in the weight it places on the human heart. Interrupted self-reflection. Imagine sitting across from someone who has just poured their heart out. Their voice was fast, urgent, spilling with frustration, sadness, or anger. They've said everything they felt they needed to say, and now they wait, for reassurance, for validation, for judgment. But instead of answering immediately, you let silence linger. A second. 5 seconds. 10. The air grows heavier with each moment. Their eyes dart, their breath shifts, and suddenly, they begin to replay their own words in their head. Without confrontation, without a single phrase from you, they start to reflect. This is the power of interrupted self-reflection. Using silence not as avoidance, but as a mirror, forcing the speaker to hear themselves, to sit with their emotions, and to reconsider what they have just unleashed. At its core, this tactic works because most people expect immediate responses in conversation. Dialogue has a rhythm: statement, reply, statement, reply. When that rhythm breaks, the brain doesn't settle into calm, it scrambles to fill the gap. After an emotional outpouring, that gap becomes an amplifier. The speaker hears their own words echo back, replaying in memory, often with more clarity than when they were spoken. The silence turns the spotlight inward. Instead of focusing on what you will say, they must confront what they have already said. Therapists and counselors sometimes use this method deliberately. After a client vents, the therapist withholds instant reaction, creating space for the person to notice their own contradictions, exaggerations, or truths. Parents do it when a child rages, letting the storm burn out, then letting the quiet expose how raw and irrational the outburst might sound. Even leaders use it, allowing silence after an impassioned speech or a defensive explanation, leaving the speaker to hear their own uncertainty. The silence doesn't accuse, but it invites self-awareness. What makes this so effective is that it bypasses defensiveness. Direct confrontation, "You're overreacting," or "That doesn't make sense," usually sparks resistance. But silence? Silence doesn't attack. It just sits. And in that stillness, the person begins to police themselves. They soften their tone, reframe their words, sometimes even apologize, all without you having to intervene. It is persuasion by absence, influence through non-response. But it can also be deeply uncomfortable. To let silence stretch requires control. Our instinct is to rush in, to smooth tension, to rescue the other from discomfort. Holding the pause feels unnatural. Yet the discomfort is the very point. It is in that awkward space that reflection is born. Many people, unable to tolerate the wait, will break it themselves, filling the silence by revising their statements, clarifying their intentions, or revealing deeper truths they hadn't meant to share. Of course, the tool can be misused. When applied with care, it encourages growth, empathy, and awareness. But when weaponized, it becomes a kind of manipulation, forcing someone to squirm under the weight of their own words, not to help them, but to dominate them. A leader who withholds response purely to intimidate, a partner who uses silence to make the other feel foolish, a friend who lets quiet stretch only to highlight someone's vulnerability, these uses can corrode trust. The difference lies in intention. Silence as reflection invites growth. Silence as punishment breeds shame. Think about the times you've felt this yourself. Maybe after an argument, when the other person didn't respond right away, you heard your own tone echo back and realized how harsh it sounded. Maybe after confessing something vulnerable, the quiet gave you space to feel the weight of your admission more deeply than their response ever could. The pause became a mirror, reflecting not their judgment, but your own. Interrupted self-reflection shows us something profound about communication. That influence is not always about what we add, but sometimes about what we withhold. Silence, in the right moment, can reveal more than words. It can turn anger into reconsideration, panic into clarity, and noise into insight. It reminds us that conversation is not just an exchange of words, it is a space where meaning ripens in the gaps. So the next time someone pours themselves out before you, resist the urge to rush in. Let the silence stand. Let it breathe. In that space, they may discover truths about themselves that no argument, no advice, no lecture could ever deliver. For silence, when timed with care, is not emptiness. It is the most eloquent mirror we can hold. The one-word cliff. Imagine sitting in a tense room. You've just finished speaking, maybe defending an idea, maybe justifying a decision, maybe admitting a mistake. The air is heavy, and everyone waits for the reply. Seconds tick by. 1, 2, 5, 10. The silence grows so loud you can almost hear it beating in your ears. Your heart begins to pound, your throat tightens, and just when you think you can't take the stillness anymore, the other person finally speaks. But instead of a long speech or a lecture, they deliver a single word. Short, precise, cutting. And in that moment, that one word feels heavier than 1,000. This is the power of the one-word cliff, a technique where silence is stretched to its breaking point, and then shattered by a word so sharp it echoes long after it's spoken. The psychology behind this effect is simple but devastating. Humans crave resolution. When a silence lingers in conversation, our brains grow restless, hungry for closure. The longer the pause, the greater the anticipation for what will come next. Stretch that pause long enough, and the eventual word becomes amplified, not because of its complexity, but because of the tension that preceded it. Like the crack of thunder after still air, the word lands with amplified force. Consider how this plays out in everyday life. In an interrogation, an officer might let a suspect ramble, explaining themselves nervously. Then, after an agonizing silence, the officer drops a single word, "Really?" That lone word, sharpened by the pause, destabilizes the suspect more than any speech could. In a courtroom, a lawyer might build suspense with silence before uttering a single guilty, making the declaration unforgettable. Even in personal relationships, silence followed by a single word like enough or why can pierce through layers of argument, forcing reflection where long explanations would only spark more resistance. The one-word cliff is not about vocabulary. It's about timing. Any word can be made powerful when it arrives at the precise moment tension peaks. Leaders have long known this. In speeches, a pause before a single word, freedom, justice, now, magnifies its resonance. Writers use the same principle. A chapter ending on a solitary word can make the reader's mind spiral into meaning. The word itself is simple. The silence around it makes it thunderous. This technique also plays on asymmetry of control. The one who can hold silence longer, who resists the urge to fill the air, is the one who owns the conversation. They dictate the tempo, while the other squirms under the weight of anticipation. When the silence finally breaks, the single word lands as if it were inevitable, the climax of an invisible build-up. It is psychological architecture. Silence is the scaffolding, the word is the stone dropped from the cliff. But the power of the one-word cliff can also be manipulative. In toxic dynamics, it can be used to intimidate, belittle, or dominate. A parent withholding response until their child is trembling, then delivering a single harsh word. A partner in an argument letting silence fester, then snapping a lone word like a weapon. The silence does the work of weakening. The word delivers the blow. What makes it effective is also what makes it dangerous, the ability to magnify meaning beyond proportion. And yet, the same technique can be used constructively. A mentor pausing before saying, proud, makes the word land as deeply as a hug. A doctor hesitating before saying, hope, can flood a patient with relief. The silence is not always cruel. It can also be reverent, giving a single word the space to shine, unclouded by noise. The one-word cliff does not always wound. It can also heal, inspire, or empower. What it reveals is something profound about communication. Meaning is not only in words, but in the space around them. Silence is not emptiness, it is amplification. When wielded with patience and precision, it can turn the simplest utterance into something monumental. So the next time you feel the urge to fill silence with chatter, pause. Hold it. Let the tension build. And then, when the moment is right, drop one word. Watch how it echoes, how it shifts the entire room. That is the one-word cliff, proof that sometimes the smallest fragment of language, when wrapped in silence, can strike with the weight of a hammer. Unanswered greeting. Imagine walking into a room. You catch someone's eye, smile, and say, hello. The word leaves your mouth lightly, almost automatically, as it has thousands of times before. But this time, there's no reply. No smile. No nod. Nothing. The silence doesn't just hang, it pierces. In an instant, what should have been a simple social ritual transforms into a moment of doubt, a fracture in the smooth surface of belonging. This is the psychological sting of the unanswered greeting, the way ignoring such a small gesture can unsettle identity, status, and security. On the surface, a greeting is trivial. But beneath it lies one of the oldest social contracts humans share, acknowledgement. To greet is to say, I see you. I recognize you. You exist to me. When that ritual is broken, when your greeting goes unanswered, it strikes at something primal. The silence feels like erasure. It forces the greeter to question, am I invisible? Am I unwelcome? Have I lost my place here? This effect is especially powerful because greetings carry expectation. Unlike a question or an opinion, a greeting does not invite debate. It is a social call and response wired deep into our psychology. When it goes unreturned, the brain interprets it not as oversight, but as rejection. Even if accidental, the unanswered greeting can feel deliberate, heavy with meaning. Think of a workplace. An employee enters the office, offers a cheerful good morning to their manager. The manager does not reply. That silence reverberates all day. Was the manager upset? Was the employee being judged? The unanswered greeting doesn't just end in silence. It plants seeds of anxiety that grow and spread. Or imagine in personal life. You text a simple "hey" to someone you care about. Hours pass. Days even. The message sits there, unanswered. The absence is not neutral, it is loud. You replay the relationship in your head, combing for reasons. The lack of response becomes a void your mind cannot resist filling, with doubt, fear, even shame. The greeting that should have been harmless becomes a mirror of insecurity. The mechanics behind this lie in the human need for reciprocity. Social bonds are reinforced by small exchanges, nods, smiles, greetings, that assure us we are seen and valued. When those exchanges are broken, even briefly, the brain interprets it as social exclusion. Studies in psychology show that being ignored, even for seconds, can trigger the same neural circuits as physical pain. An unanswered greeting is not just silence, it is a wound. And this is why it can be weaponized. People sometimes use silence in place of aggression. Refusing to answer a greeting can become a subtle form of dominance, a way of saying, "I do not need to acknowledge you. I hold the higher ground." In schoolyards, in offices, even in families, the unanswered greeting has been used as punishment, a quiet withdrawal of recognition more cutting than harsh words. It does not escalate conflict with noise, it smothers it with absence. Yet there is another layer, intention versus perception. Sometimes the silence is innocent. The other person didn't hear you, was distracted, or simply preoccupied. But the greeter rarely interprets it this way. Instead, the unanswered greeting is internalized, replayed, magnified. Our minds are wired to take social slights personally, even when they are accidents. The result is the same: doubt, unease, a shift in self-perception. And therein lies the paradox. The unanswered greeting is tiny, almost microscopic in the scale of human behavior. Yet its effect is immense. It exposes how fragile social belonging really is, how much weight rests on the simplest exchanges. One hello can affirm your place in the world. One silence can shake it. So the next time your greeting goes unanswered, notice the storm it creates inside you. Notice how quickly the questions arise, how sharp the sting feels. And remember, it is not the word itself that holds the power, but the silence that follows it. A greeting ignored is never just a moment. It is a rupture, a reminder that acknowledgement is the glue that binds human beings together. Without it, even for a second, the world feels colder. The frozen smile. Imagine an argument heating up, voices raised, words sharp, tension thick enough to cut. And then, suddenly, one person stops speaking. Their expression shifts into something unnerving, a smile. Not a warm smile, not one born of joy, but a frozen, silent curve of the lips. No explanation. No words. Just a smile held in the middle of conflict. In that instant, the energy of the room fractures. The other person falters, unsure whether they're being mocked, threatened, or dismissed. This is the frozen smile, a psychological maneuver that unsettles more deeply than shouting ever could. Humans are wired to read faces. A smile is supposed to be a universal signal of friendliness, safety, cooperation. But when it appears in the wrong context, it warps into something uncanny. It violates the rules of social exchange. Smiling in the middle of anger or stress short-circuits the brain's expectations, leaving the observer scrambling to decode intent. Is this sarcasm? Is it control? Is it danger disguised as calm? The uncertainty is the weapon. Psychologists call this kind of mismatch emotional incongruity, when expression and situation don't align. The frozen smile embodies it perfectly. In the middle of tension, silence plus a smile creates an emotional puzzle with no answer. And because the brain hates ambiguity, it reacts with unease. The smile doesn't soothe, it destabilizes. This tactic has appeared in interrogation rooms, negotiations, even hostage standoffs. A calm, silent smile can unnerve opponents more than aggression. It makes them question what you're thinking, what you're planning, what you're hiding. The absence of anger suggests control, but the presence of the smile suggests menace. That dissonance lingers, pulling the other person off balance. In personal relationships, the frozen smile can be just as manipulative. One partner smiles during a fight, not to de-escalate, but to signal superiority. The unspoken message is, I don't take your anger seriously. I am above this. I win by refusing to play. To the other person, it feels like mockery and dismissal rolled into one. The words in their throat collapse, drowned out by a silent grin that says more than language ever could. Even in everyday conflict, an argument with a stranger, a confrontation at work, the frozen smile disrupts the script. People expect pushback, volume, explanations. They do not expect calm stillness paired with a smile that lingers too long. It leaves them unmoored, doubting themselves, wondering whether they're missing some hidden knowledge or threat. Silence combined with a smile becomes psychological theater, casting one person as the enigma and the other as the confused audience. But the frozen smile is not without cost. Used habitually, it corrodes trust. Friends, partners, colleagues begin to associate your calm with manipulation rather than kindness. The smile becomes a mask, a shield that hides intent rather than reveals it. What should have been a universal signal of connection becomes a weapon that pushes others away. Over time, it isolates rather than empowers. Yet its power lies in that very unpredictability. The smile that appears when it shouldn't, the silence that stretches where words should go. Together they create a moment of cognitive dissonance too strong to ignore. The other person can't decide if they are being ridiculed, threatened, or outmaneuvered. And in that hesitation, control shifts. So the next time you see a frozen smile in the heat of conflict, remember, it is not warmth. It is not peace. It is a calculated disruption, a distortion of the rules of human interaction. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all is this: sometimes silence paired with a smile is louder, sharper, and more destabilizing than any scream could ever be. Post-statement silence. Imagine someone speaking with calm certainty. Their words carry weight, deliberate and precise. Then they stop. They do not rush to explain. They do not fill the space with more words. They simply leave the statement hanging in the air. Silence follows, heavy and thick, pressing against your mind. And in that silence, something strange happens. The words echo. They grow louder, sharper, more memorable than they would have been if the speaker had continued talking. This is the power of post-statement silence, the deliberate use of stillness after words to let them sink deeper, to force the listener to wrestle with them long after the sound has ended. Human communication is often thought of as a constant stream of words. But silence is not absence. Silence is part of the language. When a speaker leaves space after a statement, they create a vacuum, and the human brain cannot leave a vacuum alone. It fills it by replaying what was just said, amplifying its importance. Instead of being washed away by the next sentence, the words expand in memory, echoing with a resonance that is impossible to ignore. Think of how this works in daily life. A teacher tells a class, tomorrow's test will decide half your grade, and then lets the silence stretch. The students shift uncomfortably, the weight of the words digging deeper because nothing follows to soften them. Or in a courtroom, a lawyer tells the jury, this man had every reason to lie, and then pauses. The silence that follows forces the jury to confront the statement, to repeat it silently to themselves, to let it root in their minds. The words become more than words, they become conviction. Psychologists and communication experts have long recognized the effect of timing. The pause after a statement is not emptiness, it is reinforcement. The brain is drawn to what lingers. In music, this is why rests matter as much as notes. In speech, it is why silence after a powerful line feels like punctuation sharper than any period. The absence of sound magnifies meaning. There is also a subtle element of dominance in post-statement silence. By refusing to rush, the speaker demonstrates control. They show they are not desperate to persuade, not scrambling to fill space. Instead, they let the listener do the work. They allow the silence to press on the other person, forcing them to process, to reflect, even to squirm. The words become unavoidable not because they are repeated, but because they are not followed by distraction. In relationships, this effect can be profound. Imagine someone saying, "I don't feel heard in this relationship," and then falling silent. The partner is left with no immediate defense to lean on, no argument to chase, only the raw truth echoing in the stillness. Or consider a parent telling a child, "I'm disappointed in you," and then letting silence do the rest. The child hears the statement once with their ears, and then 100 times in their mind. The silence multiplies the weight of the message. But post-statement silence is not only about severity. It can also amplify beauty, inspiration, or awe. A leader ending a speech with a single line, "We will rise, no matter the cost," and then stepping back leaves the audience suspended in the words, carrying them home. A poet reading a verse and letting silence bloom afterward allows the listeners' hearts to expand into the space. Silence after truth gives truth room to breathe. And yet, the power of this technique lies in restraint. If silence follows every sentence, it loses force. If it follows the right sentence, it transforms it. It is not about stopping. It is about choosing the moment when stopping will let the words echo. The silence is not a retreat, but a final strike. At its core, post-statement silence reveals a paradox. What is not said can sometimes speak louder than what is said. The human brain craves closure, and when it does not arrive, it replays the last sound again and again. In that repetition, words grow sharper, heavier, and harder to escape. The silence becomes the amplifier. So the next time you hear someone stop speaking and let silence stretch after their words, pay attention to what happens inside you. Notice how the last phrase refuses to fade, how it circles in your thoughts, how it echoes louder than the sentences that came before. That is post-statement silence at work, the pause that turns words into weight, the stillness that makes meaning impossible to ignore. And remember this. Sometimes the most powerful thing a speaker can say is nothing at all. Strategic listening silence. Imagine sitting across from someone who is speaking passionately. They are spilling details, emotions, strategies, secrets, pouring themselves out, expecting you to respond. But you don't. You sit quietly, attentive, eyes steady, nodding just enough to show you're present. They keep talking, because the silence draws them forward. Every pause they make, they fill again, mistaking your quiet for understanding, for sympathy, for agreement. Yet inside, you may be completely undecided or even opposed. This is the power of strategic listening silence, withholding your own voice to create the illusion of depth, understanding, and alignment, all while concealing your true stance. Humans are uncomfortable with conversational voids. In dialogue, silence feels like a gap that must be filled, and more often than not, the speaker rushes to fill it themselves. Skilled listeners, or skilled manipulators, use this to their advantage. By simply staying quiet, by offering no counterpoint, they coax the other person into elaborating, clarifying, even confessing more than they intended. It is not interrogation, yet it extracts. It is not agreement, yet it feels like it. The silence becomes a mirror in which the speaker sees not only their own words but their own eagerness to be heard. This tactic appears everywhere. In negotiations, a buyer listens quietly while the seller talks themselves into lowering the price, misreading the silence as resistance or thoughtful concern. In politics, leaders listen intently to their opponents, revealing nothing, while the other side keeps speaking, trying to pin down a reaction that never comes. In relationships, a partner's quiet can feel like empathy, even if it is simply concealment. The silence itself becomes an emotional Rorschach test. People project onto it what they most want to believe. Strategic silence works because humans equate listening with understanding, and understanding with agreement. If someone listens without interruption, we feel valued. If they listen without contradiction, We assume alignment. If they remain quiet for long enough, we begin to reveal more than we planned, filling the stillness with deeper layers of ourselves. Silence, in this sense, is not passive. It is a tool of control, shaping the flow of information without exerting visible force. But this tool is double-edged. When used with care, it creates space for others to open up, to feel truly heard. A therapist's quiet nods can signal profound safety, drawing forth truths a client has never spoken. A mentor's silence can encourage reflection, allowing a student to discover answers themselves. But when used strategically to conceal, to manipulate, or to mislead, it becomes something darker. The speaker walks away feeling understood, while in reality, they've revealed themselves to someone who has risked nothing in return. The brilliance of strategic listening silence lies in its deniability. If ever questioned, the silent listener can claim neutrality. I didn't say anything, so I never misled you. But silence itself carries weight. It implies judgment, approval, interest, or dissent, depending on the speaker's need. In this way, it lets the listener shape perception without committing. They become a blank canvas, and the speaker paints their own conclusions upon it. Consider how powerful this can be in personal conflicts. If one person argues and the other simply listens without reply, the arguer may grow frustrated, anxious, or guilty. They may soften their position, apologize, or reframe their words, all without the silent party having to make a move. The silence applies pressure precisely because it hides intention. Without knowing where the other stands, the speaker feels exposed, vulnerable, unbalanced. Strategic silence also reveals something profound about human connection, that our hunger to be heard can blind us to the dangers of being listened to too closely. We equate silence with respect, when sometimes it is only strategy. We confuse the absence of contradiction with shared belief, when in reality it may simply be withheld opposition. The listener gains information, leverage, even power, while giving almost nothing back. So the next time someone listens to you without speaking, ask yourself, are they understanding, or are they observing? Are they truly with you, or are they letting you project what you want to see? And if you choose to use this strategy yourself, consider the intention. Will your silence create space for growth and reflection, or will it mask your stance while extracting from others? Because in the end, silence is never neutral. Strategic listening silence is both shield and sword. It protects you from exposure while drawing others out. It creates the illusion of deep connection while concealing what you truly think. And when mastered, it proves that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say in a conversation is nothing at all. Silence before agreement. Imagine you're in a negotiation. Someone across the table makes an offer and looks at you expectantly. They want you to nod, to agree quickly, to give them the reassurance that the deal is sealed. But instead of answering right away, you pause. You let the silence sit between you. 1 second. 2. 5. 10. The pause is not awkward for you. It's deliberate. And when you finally say yes, that agreement feels more considered, more valuable, more authoritative. This is the power of silence before agreement. A simple pause that signals thoughtfulness, increases your leverage, and reshapes how your words are received. Human beings are exquisitely sensitive to timing in conversation. Quick agreement often feels impulsive, even submissive. It suggests eagerness to please, a lack of consideration, or a weaker position. But when you delay, when you visibly think, the dynamic changes. The silence communicates, I am weighing this. I am not desperate. My agreement matters because I did not give it lightly. The very act of waiting magnifies the weight of your eventual yes. This plays out in countless settings. In business, a client who pauses before agreeing to terms conveys seriousness and caution, making their yes feel like a win to the other side. In friendships or relationships, a pause before agreeing to a plan suggests care, that you actually considered the request rather than agreeing out of habit. Even in politics, leaders often pause before granting approval, signaling that they are thoughtful decision-makers rather than pushovers. The silence itself becomes part of the performance of authority. Psychologically, this tactic works because silence creates space for the other person to doubt. When you do not answer right away, they begin to wonder, did I ask for too much? Should I sweeten the deal? Are they hesitant? In that gap, they sometimes rush to fill the silence with concessions, clarifications, or justifications. By simply pausing, you gain leverage without saying a word. The silence is not passive, it is strategic. But there is more at work here than power. The pause also signals integrity. People trust answers that feel considered. A doctor who takes a moment before saying, "Yes, that's the right treatment," feels more reliable than one who answers instantly. A mentor who hesitates before agreeing to your idea conveys that they weighed it carefully, not carelessly. The silence before agreement makes your words feel deliberate, which makes them stronger. Yet this technique has a shadow side. Used manipulatively, it can create false impressions of reluctance or superiority. Someone may pause not because they are truly considering, but because they know the silence itself pressures others. In toxic dynamics, this can become a tool to make others chase approval. The power of the pause lies in its ambiguity. No one can read your silence with certainty, so they fill it with their own insecurity. Still, when wielded with honesty, the silence before agreement elevates communication. It shows restraint, balance, and thoughtfulness in a world that often rushes toward instant gratification. It slows the tempo of interaction, turning a quick exchange into something more intentional. It makes your yes feel like a decision, not a reflex. Think of the great leaders and negotiators of history. Many were remembered less for the speed of their replies and more for the weight of their pauses. The pause is not emptiness, it is presence. It shows confidence that you do not need to rush, that your agreement is valuable enough to be earned by thought. So the next time you're asked for something, whether it's a favor, a deal, or a commitment, resist the instinct to agree instantly. Pause. Let the silence stretch, not awkwardly, but purposefully. And when you finally say yes, let it carry the weight of thought behind it. Because in that moment, the silence before agreement transforms your words from mere approval into power. Disengagement silence. Imagine talking to someone you've always trusted, maybe a partner, a friend, a colleague. The conversation feels ordinary at first, but then you notice something. Their replies are shorter, their laughter thinner, their attention somewhere else. They don't argue, they don't lash out, they don't declare anything final. Instead, they grow quiet, not in words alone, but in presence. This is disengagement silence. The slow, quiet withdrawal of emotional investment without announcement, a retreat that erodes relationships not through conflict but through absence. On the surface, nothing dramatic happens. No slammed doors, no explosive confrontations, no declarations of endings. The person is still there, physically present, but something vital is gone. The energy they once brought to conversations has dimmed. They no longer meet your gaze with the same intensity. They no longer share what's on their mind freely. Instead of challenging or comforting, they offer neutrality, polite, restrained, uninvested. It is silence in disguise, a silence that grows between the words. This kind of withdrawal is unsettling because humans expect rupture to be loud. We brace ourselves for arguments, for accusations, for fights that spell the breaking point. But disengagement silence sidesteps all of that. It offers no target to resist, no argument to win, no clear moment to repair. The relationship doesn't shatter in one dramatic instant. It erodes grain by grain, until one day you realize the foundation is gone. Psychologists call this emotional disengagement a form of stonewalling, but disengagement silence is more subtle. Stonewalling is refusal, cutting off communication completely. Disengagement silence is quieter. It's the performance of communication without the substance of connection. Words may still be exchanged, but the lifeblood of the relationship, curiosity, warmth, vulnerability, has been quietly withdrawn. Consider a relationship in decline. At first, disagreements spark openly, even fiercely, because both people still care enough to fight. But when disengagement silence sets in, the fights vanish. One person no longer bothers to protest or defend themselves. They respond with shrugs, with nods, with the kind of quiet that says, "I'm already elsewhere." The silence feels less like peace and more like abandonment, an invisible wall rising between two people still standing in the same room. In friendships, disengagement silence can be just as devastating. Messages get shorter, responses slower. Plans are no longer suggested, only tolerated. The friend still replies, but with a tone that signals distance. No one ever says, "I don't value this anymore," yet the silence carries that message anyway. The friendship does not collapse, it withers. Workplaces can be poisoned by this same silence. A once committed employee begins to disengage quietly. They stop offering ideas, stop investing in team conversations, stop caring about outcomes. They don't storm out or openly rebel, they simply go quiet. To managers, this can be more dangerous than conflict, because silence hides the decay until it is too late. The work still gets done, but the passion is gone, and with it, the heartbeat of collaboration. The danger of disengagement silence lies in its invisibility. Because it avoids open conflict, it is harder to confront. There is no obvious wound to treat, only a steady bleeding out that no one acknowledges. Those on the receiving end often sense something is wrong but cannot name it. They replay conversations in their heads, searching for signs, trying to pinpoint when the warmth left. And because nothing definitive was said, they are left in a haze of uncertainty, haunted by a silence that never explains itself. Yet there is also strategy in this silence. For some, disengagement is protection, a way to withdraw without escalation. It avoids the risks of confrontation, spares the drama of conflict. But the cost is high. Unresolved tension, unspoken truths, relationships that decay not because of what was said, but because of what was withheld. The paradox is cruel. Disengagement silence feels gentler than open hostility, but it often wounds deeper. Conflict can be navigated, repaired, even forgiven. Silence, by contrast, denies closure. It does not give the other person the dignity of knowing where they stand. It simply leaves them stranded, questioning, carrying the weight of absence. So the next time you sense that quiet shift, that hollowing of attention, that politeness without presence, don't dismiss it as calm. Recognize it for what it is, disengagement silence. It is not peace. It is not resolution. It is the slow unraveling of connection, the erosion of bonds without the sound of breaking. And perhaps the most painful truth is this: silence does not always come from lack of words. Sometimes it comes from lack of care.